sometimes felt more like a test of endurance and willpower than my accumulated legal knowledge. I barely maintained a social life, spending countless late nights poring over case law, statutes, and practice questions, and I put everything into those study sessions, so when I found out that I passed, it was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. And the next several days felt like one big party. I still had to apply to join the California Bar Association, but compared to passing the exam, that would be a relatively simple process. And after all my hard work had paid off, I figured that I deserved a little celebration. I organized get-togethers with family and friends, drank a lot of fancy champagne in some very fancy restaurants, and caught up on about 9 months of backed-up sleep deprivation. It was one of the highest points of my entire life, but it was quickly followed by one of the lowest. Just over a week after passing the bar, I was due to meet my mom for lunch. We'd been a single-parent household ever since my dad passed away when I was in my teens, and my younger brother, who still lived with her at her place, was set to join us for lunch that day. It wasn't like either of them to be late without good reason, so I tried calling each of their cell phones. And then, as calls to each of them went unanswered, I got this creeping feeling that something was wrong. I remember apologizing to the waitress before leaving the restaurant, then just as I got to my car, my brother called with the single worst piece of news I've ever received. They'd been getting ready to come meet me when Mom had suddenly collapsed. My brother had called 911, the ambulance had arrived within minutes, and she was rushed into surgery when they arrived at the hospital. But sadly, and I heard my brother's heart break as he forced himself to tell me, Mom hadn't made it. We later found out it was a catastrophic brain aneurysm, one of the worst the doctors had ever seen, and the only comfort being that she died very suddenly and didn't suffer too much. And that news destroyed us. My brother and I could barely keep ourselves together, with our grandpa and a paternal aunt having to step in to organize Mom's funeral on an estate. I went from sipping champagne in celebration to downing cheap vodka to keep lucidity at bay, and when I finally put down the bottle, sobriety awakened a kind of existential crisis in me. One moment I'd been basking in achievement, feeling like I'd conquered the world. Then, life went ahead and reminded me just how little control I really had. I'd spent years chasing the bar. It had come to define me. But what was the point of all that hard work if life could just pull the rug out from under you? It seemed really ironic. I'd worked my butt off to pass that bar, and then when I finally did it, I didn't know if I even wanted it anymore. I didn't know how to reconcile the triumph with the crushing reality that the person that I most wanted to share it with was gone. One thing which made that period of time particularly difficult was how no one in my legal circles got word of Mom's passing. I was enduring the most heartbreak of my entire life, and I was getting congratulative texts and emails from friends and mentors who sometimes asked if I wanted to meet up to celebrate. I didn't even want to get out of bed, let alone celebrate, and I felt horribly ungrateful saying this, but at the time, their praise and compliments felt almost meaningless. I was obviously in a very dark place, but I was also self-aware enough to recognize that if I didn't do something about it, if I didn't get away from the city with all its unhealthy methods of grief management, I was headed for disaster. I needed to get away, to be alone with my thoughts someplace that I could process things in my own time. And then, after a little soul-searching and a brief look online, I found what I believed was the solution. In a lot of America's national parks, way out in the middle of nowhere, there are these big old structures named fire towers. They're not all towers. Some of them are just strategically placed single-story cabins, but they're all located on ground high enough to survey the surrounding area, and they're occupied seasonally by long-term Forest Service employees called fire lookouts. A fire lookout's job is to watch for wildfires, lightning strikes, and other fire risks from their vantage point, and they spend long hours scanning the landscape for smoke or flames, using binoculars and maps to pinpoint locations. When they spot something, they report it to dispatchers with details like coordinates and weather conditions, who in turn guide firefighters towards the smoke and flames. And from what I read, it was solitary work, requiring a lot of focus and a lot of patience. The living quarters seemed pretty Spartan too, if you know what I mean. But those headstrong enough to volunteer themselves provided a valuable service to both the environment and their fellow citizens. And from that moment on that I first read about it, I was captivated. I couldn't think of a more perfect way to spend the summer than in some solitary perch out in the great American wilderness, surrounded by nothing but green leaves, blue skies, and the untamed tranquility of nature. I imagined myself in one of those remote towers, watching for smoke on the horizon, with my only masters being a notebook and a radio. It felt like a way to escape, a way to maybe find some peace amid the chaos of my grief. But getting the job wasn't as simple as packing a bag and heading out into the woods. Fire lookout positions, especially in a place like Oregon with its vast forests and history of wildfires, proved surprisingly tough to secure. First, I had to research where to apply, and then, after digging through listings that had already been closed, I found a posting for a summer gig in the Umatilla National Forest in northeastern Oregon. And the process was pretty straightforward, but the Forest Service demanded a high standard from its applicants. I had to submit a resume and a cover letter, each tailored to demonstrate that I could handle both the isolation and the responsibility. My law background didn't directly apply, but I leaned on my ability to work independently, highlighted my attention to detail honed by my legal research, and assured them that I wasn't nuts. I also had to prove that I was physically fit enough for the job, since some towers require hiking in with supplies or dealing with basic maintenance. I had to get certified in basic first aid, which I squeezed into a weekend course, and I was subjected to a background check, and I even had to complete online modules on wildfire detection and radio communication protocols. And the Forest Service wanted people who could spot a plume of smoke from miles away, report it accurately, and stay calm under pressure. And so I studied maps of the region, learned the basics of topography, and brushed up on how to use a fire finder, which is a tool lookouts use to pinpoint a fire's location. There was a phone interview too, where they grilled me on how I'd handle my weeks of solitude, spotty cell service, and the occasional bear sighting, and I told them that I needed the solitude as much as they needed someone reliable. And then, after a couple of anxious weeks of waiting, I got the call that I'd been accepted. They assigned me to a tower for the summer, starting in June, and sent me a packet with information on how to get there, what to bring, and a very stern warning about the lack of running water or electricity. It was rough, but I guess that was kind of the point. I wanted to strip everything down to the basics, to sit with my thoughts and my loss, and maybe find a way to make peace with it all. Driving out to the Table Rock Lookout was an adventure in itself as I drove out into the wild heart of northeastern Oregon. From Dayton, I took the North Touchy Road, the road climbing steadily with green rolling hills on either side as I cut through the Blue Mountains, and the air cooled as the elevation ticked up and the landscape opens into this sweeping view that stretched toward the horizon. And when I arrived, I parked at the base of the lookout. It was kind of a boxy structure, perched on a 10-foot concrete base that had first been constructed in 1949, before being upgraded with metal shutters and weatherproof siding in the late 80s. I saw the forest ranger that I was set to meet as I rolled in. It was an older guy in a green uniform with this very sun-weathered face who had driven up to give me the rundown. He walked me around the site while pointing out all the essentials. There was the outhouse, sort of modernized version with a chemical toilet, the propane stove, the radio for reporting smoke, and, most importantly, the Osborne fire finder. As we climbed the steps into the cab, a snug 14 by 14 living space with windows on all sides, the ranger took me through the daily log. He told me that I'd either get used to the quiet, or it'd drive me crazy. Then, with a smile and a handshake, he handed me the keys, wished me luck, and then took off the road in his truck. Daily life as a fire lookout settled into a quiet but steady rhythm, with mornings starting with coffee brewed on the propane stove. Then I'd step outside onto the catwalk, binoculars in hand, and scan the 360-degree panorama. West to the Columbia Basin, south to the snow-capped Wallowas, and on clearer days I could even see all the way into Idaho, to the Seven Devils about 80 miles east. As the morning progressed into the afternoon, I'd occupy myself by performing my duties and ensuring the cab and equipment were in good working order. But aside from that, it was a whole lot of nothing with just me, myself, and I. There were a lot of good upsides, the solitude, the sunsets, the ceiling of stars at night. But after a while, the challenges started to reveal themselves in earnest. The isolation proved as much a burden as it was a good. Going days without hearing another voice made my thoughts just loop endlessly, which sometimes made it feel like I was compounding my grief by depriving myself of those who actually understood. No running water meant hauling jugs up from my car, and the lack of electricity left me reliant on a battery-powered lantern during what proved to be some very spooky nights. The weather was a constant wild card, too. Lightning storms sometimes rolled through with this terrifying fury, with one threatening to spark a fire just over the ridge. And on top of all of that, the monotony of scanning the same vistas hour after hour started to wear down my focus. But still, the job's simplicity kept me grounded and brought a great deal of peace. At least until one day when I experienced what I can only describe as the most bizarre and terrifying experience of my entire life. It was mid-afternoon on a very dry and hazy day. I was on the catwalk, binoculars pressed to my eyes, sweeping the forested slopes below for any telltale wisps of smoke. My routine scans had become second nature by that point, but as I panned across a clearing about 2 miles downhill, something caught my eye. A lone, upright figure moving steadily through the trees. At first, I just thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a deer standing upright. It is a thing, look it up. But as I continued to track that shape through the binoculars, I realized the style of walking was unmistakably human. A lone hiker or camper wasn't unheard of out there, even at 6,250 feet. People venture into the backcountry all the time for all sorts of different reasons. But even so, I lowered the binoculars, rubbed my eyes, and raised them again to confirm. The figure was still there, maybe a mile and a half out now, heading southeast. A dark silhouette threading between the pines, and their walk was very unhurried, but deliberate. Usually speaking, a lone hiker wouldn't be anything for me to worry about. But in that moment, something just kept nagging me. I walked back into the cabin, grabbed my radio, then after informing Ranger HQ of the hiker's sighting, I asked them to confirm the status of the area. And the response crackled back after a brief pause, and this is really my best recollection of what was said. Base to Table Rock, copy that. Be advised your sector is under evacuation orders as of 0800 this morning. Fire weather spiking, red flag warnings in effect, and we've got active burns 20 miles southeast and moving with the wind. If you can make contact, instruct them to evac immediately. Nearest road access is Forest Road 64, about 3 miles from their position. Over. I told the ranger that I understood, but as I did so, I felt my stomach drop. Wildfires had been a looming threat all week, with dry lightning and gusty winds keeping firefighting crews on edge, but that was the first time it felt real, and the idea of someone hiking out there, oblivious to the danger, dragged me from my usual detachment. I had to warn them. But how? I swung the binoculars back towards that figure, and he was just a speck by then, but still visible weaving through a stand of pines. Yelling wouldn't really carry a mile and a half through the wind. I had no megaphone, and even if they were carrying a radio, I had no idea what frequency to reach them on. I grabbed the firefinder, aligned it with his position, and jotted the coordinates. I then bolted down the tower's steps to my car. I kept a whistle and an air horn in the glove box for emergencies, so once I was back on the catwalk, I blasted the air horn in 3 sharp bursts and then followed with a piercing blast from my whistle. Through the binoculars, I saw them pass. They'd heard it. And I started waving my arms wildly, uselessly shouting "evacuate" into the wind, and then fired off another trio of sharp bursts from that horn. The hiker hesitated, then shifted course slightly, angling westward, what I'd hoped would be Forest Road 64. I radioed HQ again, informed them that I'd made some noise contact, and updated them on the hiker's change in direction. But then, in order to ascertain if the hiker had safely made their way out of the area, I asked HQ if they could send a patrol to intercept them. This was standard practice in Umatilla, as fire lookouts can't exactly go abandoning their post every time they see something unusual. I'd been specifically instructed to request a patrol should an event like that arise, but HQ's response left me stunned. They told me, "Negative, Table Rock. Cannot dispatch to FR-64. Can you make it out to his position? Over." It was easily one of the most loaded questions I'd ever been asked, because it was either a case of I make it out to the hiker's position to make sure that they were evacuating, or potentially condemn an oblivious hiker to a very slow and agonizing death. The fires were still around 20 miles off, but with a red flag warning, that could change very quickly. It was down to me to make sure that the hiker was evacuating, or I could potentially have their death on my conscience for the rest of my life. And when I thought of it like that, it was an easy decision to make. I grabbed my pack from the cabin, which was already stocked with water, a first aid kit, and a map and a radio, and then threw in the air horn and whistle for good measure. I clipped my binoculars to my belt, put on my hiking boots, and then jotted down a quick entry that said, 15:30, leaving post to locate individual southeast of position. Will report back. I locked the cab, took one last scan of the horizon, and then started down the steps, bypassing my car when I reached the bottom. The first half mile was drivable, but beyond that I'd be on foot anyway, and time in that situation mattered. I set off southeast on foot, following the bearing that I'd locked in with the firefinder. The descent was steep at first, with a plateau dropping into a slope of loose rock that crunched and shifted precariously under my feet. Where I could, I stuck to game trails that I'd explored previously, weaving through clumps of brush as the wind carried a faint heat that made my skin prickle. I brought the binoculars up to my eyes every so often, scanning ahead for movement, but the forest was very dense out there, and without my vantage point, visibility was patchy at best. And after about 15 to 20 minutes of speed hiking, I hit a shallow draw, the terrain leveling off into a mix of open meadows and dense timber. I figured that he might still be a mile out, maybe less if he kept his pace, so I blew these 3 sharp blasts with my whistle, but got nothing in response. And I pushed on, following the draw southeast by hiking along the dry creek bed littered with rocks. My boots sank into pine needles as sweat beaded down my forehead, and every few hundred yards, I stopped to scan with the binoculars, glassing the ridge lines and gaps in the trees. And at one point, a mule deer bolted from a thicket, which scared me a lot more than I'd care to admit. And almost as a way of steadying myself, I radioed HQ to let them know that I was en route, but hadn't made contact yet. They acknowledged and urged me to stay safe, and then I went. After maybe 30 minutes of relentlessly powering through the woods, I crested a low rise and caught a flicker of motion through a stand of lodgepole pines, maybe 300 yards out. It was the hiker. It had to be. This lanky figure in what looked like a camouflaged hunting shirt, trudging along with his head down like he had no clue that he was headed toward disaster. I cupped my hands and shouted, "Hey! Evacuation order! You gotta get out of here!" The wind dampened my voice, but he heard me, and although he stopped and turned for a second or two, he simply turned around and just carried on walking through the woods. I just cursed under my breath and then started to close the gap, jogging where the ground allowed me to until I was certain that I was within earshot. "Hey!" I called again breathlessly. "This area's being evacuated! Wildfires! You gotta head west for Forest Road 64, now!" I was about 50 yards away from him by then, and once again he stopped but didn't turn. I expected a hiker, a camper, someone ordinary. But what I saw clawed at the edges of my sanity, and even now, I honestly don't know if it was real or if the combination of grief and isolation had finally caused something inside of me to snap. The man didn't look like a hiker. In fact, he looked very, very sick. As my jaw dropped and my eyes widened into what must have been huge horrified circles, I realized the man was bare-chested. The reason it looked like he was wearing camouflage was because his skin was a mess of thick, dark scabs and bulging, glistening boils that seeped green-yellow pus. And his torso heaved with each breath, these sores pulsing as his chest rose and fell, and as I looked at him, all I could do was freeze, dead in my tracks. Was my mind playing tricks on me? Had that grief and solitude and the endless hours staring off into the unchanging horizon worn down my mind? Or was that nightmarish sight standing before me actually real? I remember asking if he needed medical attention and mentioned that I had a first aid kit with me, but my overarching memory of that exchange was hearing my own voice just cracking with fear. I was on the verge of being overwhelmed with shock and confusion, but the man didn't flinch. He just stood there with his back to me, head slightly cocked like he was listening to me. And as he stayed quiet, I felt a cold sweat forming on my neck, and I remember muttering, "Is this real?" to myself. But the details were too sharp, too vivid for my mind. If it was a hallucination, then I had no idea that they could feel that lucid. And I remember being gripped by this combination of terror and confusion as the man turned. The skin on his face, chest, and bald head was identical to that on his back. All these boils and scabs that looked incredibly painful. And then he just looks at me and kind of smiles. And his smile wasn't threatening, but it was deeply disturbing all the same, and even from 15 to 20 feet away, I could see that his teeth were missing. And yet, despite the terror clawing up my spine and this revulsion in my gut, despite being completely convinced that I was suffering some kind of sudden and severe mental illness, all I sort of felt was peace. It was like an odd, out-of-body experience or something. I knew what was happening was all wrong. I knew that I should be terrified. But all I could feel rising up in my chest was the sensation of bright, bubbling joy. Like I'd found out that no matter what was going to happen in my life, everything was going to be okay. I felt myself begin to smile, and as I did, the man's smile widened and let out a short but unmistakable chuckle. I suddenly felt as if I wanted to laugh, to double over and cackle, even as my mind screamed at me not to. It was like I'd lost control of myself. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was feel while staring back into the man's small black eyes. I was convinced I'd lost my mind. The internal monologue that went through my head in those moments were the last sane thoughts I'd ever have. And then just when things seemed like they couldn't get any stranger, they did. The boiled-covered man opened his mouth and a whisper slipped out. It was too faint to catch, little more than a hiss beneath the wind, but then somehow his words came out of my mouth. "Go home," we said together. The words weren't mine. I hadn't thought them, hadn't meant them, but I said them. Yet before I could really think about what had just happened, I was turning around and walking away, back in the direction of that lookout tower without ever once turning around to look back at that man. I didn't want to leave him there. I didn't want to stop staring at this impossibility. But at the same time, I couldn't stop myself from walking away, and nor did I want to. And my head was spinning the whole way back. Hallucination or not, what I'd seen felt way too real, and since I'd never experienced anything like it, I was terrified. It's difficult to describe, but it was like the strange sense of involuntary joy that I felt still lingered, and I only felt truly in control of myself again when I climbed the tower's steps, hands shaking as I locked myself in the cabin. Through the windows, I scanned the forest, half expecting to see the boil-covered man lumbering up the stairs after me, but there was nothing but trees. I grabbed the radio, thumb hovering as I began wondering if the man had been there at all, or if I'd whispered "go home" to no one but myself. Following my encounter, or whatever the hell it was, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me. And for almost 2 months, the cab had been my refuge, my home. But after the events of that day, I felt trapped. I spent the night awake, jumping at every creak of the cab, peering out the windows into the dark, half convinced that I'd see that boil-covered man climbing the steps. And by morning, The forest was still, but I couldn't trust what I saw anymore, and if I couldn't trust myself, I knew I had to get out of there. I grabbed the radio, steadying myself as I thumbed the transmit button. Then I just told them the truth. I told them that on mental health grounds I was no longer fit to continue the season. Then when they asked for more specifics, I told them that I thought I'd been seeing things. There was a pause, long enough that I wondered if the signal had dropped. Then the ranger supervisor got on the line and asked what I meant by seeing things. And again, I was just 100% honest with them. I told them exactly what had happened with the boil-covered man, that the experience had left me extremely shaken, and that I believed that I needed to seek treatment as soon as possible. There was another pause, and then I heard the supervisor's voice soften through the static. And he told me they took that kind of thing very seriously. The only issue was they were stretched too thin to get me a replacement immediately. The supervisor asked if I could last another 24 hours while they found another lookout, and when I said yes, he told me to hang in there, and then ended the transmission. I tried to stick to the routine for one last day, scanning the horizon, logging weather, sipping water to stay sharp, but every shadow in those trees made my pulse spike. Headquarters checked in on me every so often, so I kept the radio close, but that night, I avoided the catwalk, afraid of what I might see below. Sleep came in spurts, and I was jolted awake by strange dreams. And then, first thing in the morning, the call came. Table Rock, this is Ranger HQ. We got a replacement. They'll be over this morning. You're good to clear out after handover. Over. And relief hit me like a wave, though it was tinged with this sharp sense of unease. If what I'd experienced was indeed a hallucination, suffering another while on the drive home could probably be fatal. See something in the middle of the freeway, swerve to avoid something that's not even there, and that might be the end of me. The thought was still in my mind a few hours later when I spotted a Forest Service truck in the distance kicking up dust as it rumbled down the forest road. My replacement was a ranger in her 40s, all business with a clipboard and a nod. I walked her through the cab, then, as I handed over the keys, I felt my hands shaking. The ranger asked if I was okay, and I just told her that it had been a rough stretch, and she chose not to press any further. After the handover, I grabbed my pack, took one last look at the tower, and then climbed into the car. I didn't glance in the rearview as I drove away. I just wanted to be gone. And about a week later, I was sat in a psychiatrist's office, staring at the beige carpet with hands clenched in my lap, mentally rehearsing what I was even going to say. And then when it was time, I told the doctor everything, from my mom's death to what I'd seen in the woods. She listened and jotted notes on a pad. And then after confirming that I'd been clean and sober during my time as a lookout, she told me what I'd experienced sounded a lot like a stress-induced hallucination, which apparently are surprisingly common following a sudden loss like that. She said my brain was misfiring, turning guilt and sadness into something I could see, and she then asked if I blamed myself for my mom's death. I didn't answer right away. I hadn't been there when it happened, and that ate at me. Towards the end of the appointment, the doctor suggested a brief course of medication, something for anxiety and sleep, and therapy to process the grief. Then over the next few weeks, I started to feel a little better. But I only felt much better about Mom's sudden passing, and somehow, despite all the pills and therapy sessions, what I'd seen out in those woods didn't feel any less real. I told the psychiatrist about it at the follow-up, and he said it was my mind holding on to the trauma. I hadn't been to many therapy sessions, so he continued to push for that, claiming that talking might help me let it go. I nodded, but mentally I didn't commit. Logically, I guessed it made sense. Grief plus stress equals brain glitch, but part of me wasn't convinced. My memories of the man and how I felt in his presence didn't feel hazy, scattered, or out of sync. And even all these years later, I can still remember him like it was yesterday. I've been a forest ranger for 8 years now, and for the past 5 summers, I've been stationed at a fire lookout in the Pacific Northwest. Most folks at HQ just call me the Loner, with a good-natured chuckle. You see, I'm a single man, always have been, and I reckon I always will be. There's a certain freedom in that, a kind of simplicity that I've learned to enjoy. Summers up in my lookout tower are where I feel most at peace, surrounded by nothing but the endless sweep of pines and fir stretching out beneath me. And the tower is my weathered wooden perch, perched high on a rocky ridge with a wraparound deck and windows that give me a complete view of the surrounding forest. It's just me up there, with nothing but my stack of dog-eared paperbacks, some beat-up coffee pot, and the soft crackle of my radio that I use to communicate. I really don't mind the solitude. In many ways, I like it. You just can't find peace like that anywhere else. The way the wind whispers through the trees and the way the sun paints the sky with orange and purple as it sets, it's tranquil, almost sacred to me, and out there I'm not just an observer. I'm a part of nature. And it really does make you a poet out there with only your mind to think. But there was one summer a few years back when something really shook me to my core, an incident that I'll carry with me until the day that I die. It started like any other season. In early June, I hauled my gear up in the winding trail to the tower. Canned goods, a few fresh shirts, my rifle, and a journal that I sometimes scribble in when the mood strikes me. The forest was alive with chickadees jumping between branches, along with the chatter of squirrels and the occasional thud of a pine cone hitting the ground. I settled into my routine, spending mornings at the desk, scanning the horizon for smoke, while just logging wind speeds and temperatures for the daily report. And for the first few weeks it was paradise, same as always. Then, about a month in, something changed. I couldn't pinpoint it at first, it was more a feeling than anything concrete. I'd be out on the deck, sipping my coffee, and then suddenly, the hairs on the back of my neck would start prickling. The woods got quiet, too, almost unnaturally. No bird song, no rustling of leaves, just this sort of eerie stillness. I've been around long enough to know that the forest has its moods, but this felt way different, and I started to think that there might be a mountain lion in the area, possibly. There are ghosts out there, silent, solitary, and damn near invisible until they want you to see them. I'd found signs of one not too far from the tower a week earlier, a pile of scat and some claw marks gouged into a cedar trunk. So anytime I left the tower, whether to check the rain gauge or haul water from the creek, I slung my old Winchester bolt action over my shoulder. Nothing fancy, but she was reliable. That uneasy feeling, though, dragged on for weeks. I'd wake up in the middle of the night convinced that I'd heard something. Might be a twig snapping or a low growl, but when I grabbed my flashlight and sweep the beam across the clearing below, there'd be nothing. I started double-checking the lock on the tower door, something I'd never bothered with before, and during the day I'd just scour the ridgelines with my binocs and look for any hint of movement. But again, there was nothing, just trees swaying in the breeze with the occasional hawk circling overhead. My nerves felt frayed, but I told myself that it was just the isolation getting to me. You spend enough time alone out there and your mind can start to play tricks on you, believe me. Still, I couldn't shake that sense that something was out there, watching me. Then, just as mysteriously as it started, it stopped. The birds came back, their songs were filling the air again, and a family of deer wandered through the clearing one morning, nibbling at the grass while acting completely unafraid. The forest felt alive again, and for the first time in a long time I allowed myself to relax. I've even laughed at myself a little, jumping at shadows, spooked by my own imagination. I still carried the rifle, but it felt more like habit than necessity, and things seemed back to normal again. Then one afternoon in late August, I hiked down to a creek about a half-mile from the tower to check the water level. It's a peaceful spot, where the water winds through mossy rocks under the shade of nearby pines, and I was crouched by the bank, scribbling a note in my logbook when I noticed my bootlace had come untied. The last thing I wanted was a trip hazard during my return journey, so I set my rifle against a rock and bent down to retie it. I was still fumbling with the lace when I heard it. A sharp, sudden thwack, as something struck the tree behind me with a massive amount of force. I turned around, and there it was, an arrow buried deep in the bark. It had missed my head by inches. Panic hit me like a runaway freight train. I didn't stop to think. I acted entirely on instinct. I grabbed my rifle and ran, boots pounding the dirt, branches clawing at my arms as I tore through the brush as fast as my legs could carry me. My lungs were burning, my pulse thundered in my ears, but I didn't even think about slowing down until I was safely back at the tower. I remember bolting up the stairs, 2 at a time, then slamming the door behind me before I turned the lock. My hands were still trembling as I took up a position by the west window, peering out at the tree line with my rifle at the ready. The forest looked still and calm, but I wasn't fooled. Someone had just tried to kill me. I fumbled for the radio, almost dropping it, and keyed the mic. "HQ, this is Lookout 7, I said, alarmed at the terror in my own voice. "Someone just tried to shoot me with an arrow and they're still out there. I need backup now." I remember how a ranger's voice came back in moments, sounding calm but very urgent. "Copy that, Lookout 7, he said. "Sit tight. We're sending a team your way." I stayed by the window, my rifle at the ready, eyes darting between the trees, and every shadow seemed like hidden danger, while every dull noise sounded like a footstep. It took an hour for backup to arrive, but when it did, 3 armed rangers piled out of a dusty jeep, scanning their surroundings as they did so. I met them at the base of the tower and led them back to the creek. My legs were still shaky from my run back to that tower, and I can safely say that the walk back down to the creek was one of the most terrifying and unnerving experiences of my entire life. Someone had hunted me, and had almost killed me in the process. But during that walk back to the creek, it was us that were hunting them, not an animal, but a person. When we arrived at the creek, the arrow was still there, lodged in that tree. Everyone went quiet, and we fanned out to search the area for tracks of broken branches, anything to tell us who had been there or where the shot had come from. But we found nothing. The ground was a carpet of pine needles, too soft to hold a footprint, and the shooter had not left a trace. One of the rangers yanked the arrow free and studied it. It looked handmade, but the question of who made it was anyone's guess. Someone suggested that it might have been a poacher, maybe someone who hated the federal government for whatever reason, but even so, his tone lacked any conviction. And they stayed with me for 2 days, taking shifts on the deck, rifles ready, but nothing happened. No more arrows, no signs of life beyond the usual forest critters, and whoever shot that arrow at me had just melted away, leaving us with more questions than answers. The rest of the summer just dragged on, uneventful but tense. I'd sit up most nights, staring out into the dark, the rifle across my lap, waiting for something that just never came. The forest I loved felt different now, like it was hiding secrets I'd never get to the bottom of. I finished the season, packed up my gear, and hiked out just as the first rain started to fall. The whole thing doesn't haunt me or anything, but even now, years later, I can still hear that arrow snapping into the tree, and I remember the cold dread that dripped over me in the seconds afterwards. I still work the towers, still love the wild, but there's a part of me that always is looking over my shoulder, wondering who was out there that summer, and why they tried to end my life. I'd been a forest ranger for about 6 years when everything with Ted happened. It was summer of 1997, and I was still pretty green compared to him. Ted was the guy everyone looked up to. 30 years on the job, steady as a rock, the kind of man who could stare down a grizzly and not even blink. He was in his late 50s then. He was wiry but strong, with a graying beard and a voice that seemed to demand people's attention. We all respected him, not just because he's been around forever, but because he had this way of making you feel like he had everything under control. Ted was like an uncle to us, gruff but warm, always ready with a story or a piece of advice, and boy did he love the fire lookouts. Every summer, he'd volunteer to man one of the towers, spending weeks alone with nothing but the forest and a radio for company, and he said it was the only place that he could really think. That year, he'd gone out to the tower in the northwest corner of our national forest, a spot called Hatcher's Point. It was remote, about a 2-hour drive from the ranger station, with most of the journey being on winding dirt roads that turned to mud when it rained. The tower itself was a squat, as they say, this wooden thing perched on a rocky outcrop. I've been up there once or twice myself, and it was so peaceful that, in a way, it made you forget the rest of the world even existed. Ted had been out there for maybe 3 weeks by mid-July, checking in daily with the station like clockwork. His voice would come in over the radio every morning, saying stuff like Hatcher's Point, all clear, weather's holding, and that was Ted's style of speech in a nutshell, short, to the point, and reliable. But then, on July 21st, everything changed. It was late afternoon when his call came in. I was at the station with a couple of other rangers sorting through maps and drinking terrible coffee when the radio suddenly burst into life. And a split second later, Ted's voice came through the static, very sharp and panicked in a way that I'd never heard before. "This is Hatcher's Point," he said. "I got a fire that's coming in fast from the southwest. Winds are picking up. Might have to evac." There was a pause. Then, quieter. "It's moving too quick. I gotta move." And after that, the transmission went dead. We scrambled into action. A fire that close to Hatcher's Point wasn't something we'd seen coming. There had been no lightning strikes reported and no signs of smoke on the horizon that morning. But Ted didn't panic over nothing. Within an hour, we had a crew mobilized, and I was part of the team sent to scout the area from the ground while helicopters flew overhead, and by nightfall, we could see the glow of flames chewing through the forest. It was a nasty one. Dry conditions and a stiff wind had turned into a real monster. The fire tore through the ridge near Hatcher's Point, swallowing trees and spitting out plumes of smoke that blotted out the sky. We assumed Ted had made it out. He knew those woods better than anyone, and in all likelihood, he'd taken the access road and headed back toward the station. The fire burned for 2 days before we got it under control. Then, when it finally died down, the area around Hatcher's Point was this charred, smoking mess. There were acres of blackened stumps and ash with the ground still warm, but the tower itself was gone, reduced to a complete pile of beams. Ted's truck was still parked at the trailhead, which didn't sit right with us. He should have driven out, or at least left a note, but there was no sign of him. We figured that he'd hiked out on foot, maybe gotten turned around in the chaos. He was due back to the station hours after he called in, but when a full day passed with no sign of him, the head ranger called for a search and rescue effort. I was on the team that went looking for him. There were 8 of us, plus a couple of dogs, fanning out from the trailhead as we kicked up clouds of ash that stuck onto our boots and pant legs. We called out Ted's name, our voice echoing around that dead valley, but apart from the occasional creak of a branch giving way under its own weight, the forest just stayed silent. I remember thinking how creepy it all looked. Nothing but miles of devastation, no birds or wind, just this overwhelming sense of death pushing down on us. We found him late that afternoon, almost by accident. One of the dogs started barking, pulling its handler toward a narrow ravine about a mile from where the tower had stood. I was close enough to hear the guy shout, and I remember running over with my heart pounding, praying for the best possible outcome. Ted was down there, sprawled at the bottom among the rocks and fallen trees. He was alive, but barely. Both his legs were bent at wrong angles, and the bones snapped clean through. His face was smeared with soot, and his eyes were wide, darting around like he was still scanning for danger. He didn't seem to recognize us at first. He just kept muttering under his breath, but I couldn't make out exactly what he was saying. We got a stretcher down to him and hauled him up, but that's when he started vomiting. It came up in thick, black spurts, splattering the ground like motor oil, and the smell was sharp and bitter like burned meat mixed with some chemical. It was so bad that I had to turn away. We radioed for a medevac, and by the time the chopper landed, Ted was slipping in and out of consciousness as his breath became more and more shallow. They flew him to the nearest hospital, and I didn't see him again until a few days later when the head ranger asked me to come along while he talked to him. Ted was propped up in a bed in the ICU, hooked up to an IV and looking 10 years older than he had a week ago. His legs were in casts and his skin was still this grayish, like the life hadn't quite come back to him yet. Our head ranger sat down beside him, and after some small talk, he asked what happened. Ted's voice was weak, but he didn't hesitate, and although this probably isn't exactly what he said, it's definitely the gist of it. "I saw something out there," he said, and he was staring at the ceiling as he said this. After the fire passed, I went back to check the tower to see what was left. The ground was still smoking and there was ash everywhere. And then I saw it. It was big but thin, like a starved, diseased bear. Its skin was all black, burned looking, hanging off of it like it'd been cooked. It was eating the ash, scooping it up with its paws and shoving it into its mouth. Our head ranger, Bill, shifted in his chair, and I felt like the hair on my neck was standing up, but Ted kept going. He said, "I couldn't move at first. I just stood there watching. Then it turned its head, and I swear it looked right at me. No eyes, just holes, but I felt it see me. And I ran. Didn't think, didn't look back. And the next thing I know, I'm falling. My legs are gone under me. And I don't remember much after that." Bill didn't say much, he just nodded and told Ted to rest. But I could tell he was rattled. Ted wasn't the kind of guy to make up stories. He didn't drink, didn't mess with drugs, and didn't even like telling tall tales around the campfire. And then there was the black stuff he'd thrown up. The doctor had pumped his stomach when he got to the hospital and they found something strange. Chunks of burned bark and partially digested mixed with a near-toxic amount of tree ash. They said it was like he'd been eating it, though they couldn't figure out why. Ted didn't offer an explanation either. He just shook his head when they asked, like he couldn't find the words. And he was in the hospital for weeks, long enough for his legs to start healing, and when he got out, he told Bill that he was done. 30 years in the service and he was retiring, effective immediately. We threw him a party at the station that fall. Nothing fancy, just some burgers and beer. A cake with "Happy Trails, Ted" written in blue icing, I remember. He showed up in a flannel shirt and jeans, leaning on crutches, and he smiled and laughed with everyone like it was old times. He even made a little speech, thanking us for all the good times and saying that he was looking forward to fishing and fixing up his old log cabin. But there was something off. I noticed it when I caught him staring out the window at the trees beyond the parking lot. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and his hands gripped the crutches so tight his knuckles went white. It was like he was waiting for something to come out of those woods. I asked him once, a few months later when I ran into him in town, if he was okay, and he said he was fine, but his voice was flat, and he didn't look at me when he said it. Ted moved out to that cabin of his about an hour from the forest boundary and kept to himself. I heard he still fished sometimes, but he never came back to visit the station. The last time I saw him was in '99 at the grocery store. He was thinner, his beard gone white, and he moved slowly, like every step hurt more than just his legs. We talked for a minute, and he seemed cheerful enough. He asked about the crew, told me that he'd caught a big trout the week before, but when I mentioned Hatcher's Point in an offhand comment, his face changed. His jaw tightened and he looked past me, out the store window toward the mountains. Then, quiet enough that I almost missed it, he told me, "Don't go up there." Then he turned and sort of hobbled off down the aisle. I never found out what he really saw that day. Maybe it was fire, the smoke, the pain messing with his head, and maybe he ate the ash out of delirium, some kind of survival instinct gone wrong. The doctors never had a good answer for that part, but I know Ted, or I knew him, and I've never shaken the feeling that whatever he ran into out there wasn't just his mind. Something followed him back from that ravine, something he couldn't leave behind no matter how far he got from the forest, and I think it stayed with him until the day he died. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, this was an enriching therapy session. Hear all these stories anywhere you listen to podcasts on the Let's Read podcast. I recently came across a collection of old letters at an estate sale in Edinburgh, Scotland. They were tucked away in a weathered trunk marked simply with the name C.E. Brady. At first glance, I thought that they might be just routine correspondence from a different era, but as I began to read, I realized these letters told a very haunting story, and I thought the Let's Read audience might appreciate this chilling tale captured in these letters. I've transcribed them here exactly as I found them, and leaving it up to you to decide if they are simply the remnants of history, or maybe something more sinister. As I said, what follows is a series of letters, exchanged between several authors during the spring and summer of 1891. They provide us with an insight into the life and times of one Charles E. Brady, a world-renowned big game hunter from Scotland, as well as those of his assistant, Jack Thompson. And they read as follows. Government House, Livingston, North Rhodesia, the 20th of April, 1891. Sir, in service of Her Majesty Queen Victoria, it is with great respect for your extraordinary reputation that I take up my pen to write to you. Your feats in the wild places of Africa are the stuff of fable, and your name is spoken with admiration in the halls of both London and the colonies. It is therefore to you that I must turn in a matter of utmost urgency and peril. Reports have reached me of grave disturbances in the Luangwa Valley. A beast of no ordinary description has wrought havoc upon the local settlements, destroying crops, maiming livestock, and, lamentably, causing injury and loss of life among the native population. Those who have survived its wrath describe it as a lion of monstrous size and ferocity, though some accounts veer in the realm of the fantastic, suggesting a creature beyond the natural order. Such an affliction upon the people not only jeopardizes their lives and livelihoods, but also imperils the fragile stability of the region. I need not tell a man of your experience that fear and discontent left unchecked can fester into larger troubles. Given your unparalleled expertise in tracking and dispatching the great predators of the African wilderness, I implore you to lend your skill to this urgent endeavor. Your task, should you accept, will not be without danger, but I trust that your courage is equal to the challenge. I shall see to it that you're provided with a capable retinue, adequate supplies, and whatever provisions you might require for the journey. I am fully prepared to compensate you handsomely for your efforts, but I hope that the opportunity to once more test your mettle against nature's fiercest adversaries while rendering a noble service to the crown might also weigh in your decision. I await your reply with great anticipation and remain, sir, yours in earnest faith, Sir Arthur Ashbury, Governor of Northern Rhodesia. Camp on the Luang River, Northern Rhodesia, the 3rd of August, 1891. My dearest Margaret, I hope this letter finds you well, my love, and that our little ones behaving themselves as I would expect. By now you'll have received my last note sent from the ship, but I am writing to you now from deep in the heart of Africa, where the work I've been called to undertake has finally been laid bare. Margaret, it is no simple task that keeps me from your arms, but one of great peril, and if I succeed, one of great reward. I have come here to hunt a lion, but not just any lion. The beast is a terror, Margaret, a man-eater, prowling the Luangwa Valley and laying waste to everything in its path. has already taken the lives of several poor souls and left the villages in fear. It's no ordinary creature, I can tell you that much. The natives speak of it in whispers like it's a devil from the bush. And I won't lie to you, Margaret, it's dangerous work. This lion is clever and fierce, and the land here is nothing like I've ever seen before, wild and untamed. The nights are alive with the cries of beasts, and the air is thick with the scent of earth and fire. But Mr. Brady and I have been given a team of trackers who know the terrain, and I've got my rifle in good working order. If I'm careful and keep my wits about me, I'll see this through. The rewards, Margaret, are far more than I could ever hope for back home. The governor himself has promised a handsome sum for my service, enough to see us a good many winters and set the children on a fine path. This could be the opportunity we prayed for, Margaret, the one that lifts us from the scrape of life and into something better. I promise you this, I will return. 4 or 5 months at the most, and I'll be back to you in the weans. Until then, I ask you to keep me in your prayers and know that every step I take, I carry your love with me. You're the strongest woman I know, Margaret, and it's your face that keeps me steady when the shadows grow long. Kiss the little ones for me and tell them their father will soon be home with the tales of Africa and a heart full of love for them all. Yours now and always, Jack. Camp on the Luangwa River, Northern Rhodesia, 5th of August, 1891. To His Excellency Sir Arthur Ashbury, Governor of Northern Rhodesia, Livingston. Your Excellency, I write to you with a heavy heart and grave tidings from the field. Upon receiving your summons and undertaking this expedition, I arrived with high hopes of quickly addressing the threat posed by the man-eating lion terrorizing the Luangwa Valley. However, what I found at the appointed village of the Luangwa River was a scene of utter desolation. The village was silent, its only occupants the dead. The beast you spoke of had struck before my arrival, leaving a trail of destruction and grief. Several bodies lay scattered, showing unmistakable signs of a lion's ferocious attack. Among them, I regret to inform you, was the man you appointed as my contact, a fine fellow, I am sure, who tragically fell victim to the creature's savagery. The surviving villagers, in their terror, have fled to seek safety further afield, leaving the settlement abandoned. This turn of events leaves me at a crossroads. With no fresh intelligence on the lion's whereabouts, I find myself compelled to return to my camp downriver and await further reports of its movements. It is my hope that the beast's next appearance will be met with swift action, but it troubles me deeply that its rampage may cause further suffering before I am able to bring it down. The lion's cunning is unlike any predator I've encountered in all my years of hunting. It is methodical, striking where it senses weakness and retreating before it can be caught. The terrain of this valley, though breathtaking in its beauty, provides ample cover for such a creature to stalk unseen. I will need every ounce of patience and skill to track it to its lair and end its reign of terror. I shall remain vigilant, Your Excellency, and send word as soon as new developments arise. It is my solemn vow that I will not leave this valley until the lion has been dealt with and the peace of its people restored. I only pray that the cost of lives and livelihood may be kept to a minimum during the time it takes to finish this grim task. I shall send updates as regularly as possible, though the isolation of this region makes communication difficult. Rest assured, I am dedicated to this endeavor and will see it through to the very end. Yours in service to the Crown, Charles E. Brady, Big Game Hunter and Explorer. Camp at Luangwa Fork, Northern Rhodesia, 14th August, 1891. My dearest Margaret, I pray this letter reaches you safely, though I fear its contents may cause you distress. I write with a heavy heart, for this expedition has taken a dire turn. What we thought was a single dreadful foe has proven to be far worse, and the task before us is now greater than I could have ever imagined. We've been tracking this lion southward along the river, following its bloody trail, when word reached us of fresh attacks in the northern villages. At first, we dismissed it as an error, a case of frightened minds spreading false alarms. But the reports persisted, and when we examined the patterns, a horrifying truth emerged. There is not one man-eater, but two. The realization chilled me to the very bones. These lions are no ordinary beasts, Margaret. They work in tandem, like a force of darkness bent on tormenting this land. As one strikes in the south, the other moves north, leaving destruction and death in their wake. The people here speak of them as demons in lion form sent to punish the living. I am no superstitious man, but looking into the devastation they have wrought, I can see how such fears take hold. We are left with no choice but to divide our strength. Mr. Brady will remain in the south while I make my way northward to defend the villages there. It is a grave risk, splitting our forces this way, but it's the only chance we have to shield the people from further loss. I trust that God will guide my hand and give me the strength to stand against this evil. The situation is desperate, Margaret. I won't lie to you. These lions are cunning and relentless, and the fear they sow weakens the resolve of even the strongest among us. But I cling to the belief that good men, Christian men, will prevail. We fight not for glory, but for the lives of the innocent, and I know in my heart that such a cause cannot be in vain. Please, my love, keep me in your prayers, and as I keep you and the children in mine. I hold your image close to my heart, and it gives me courage when the nights grow dark and the shadows press close. And I promise you, Margaret, I will return to you no matter the trials that lie ahead. Tell the little ones their father loves them dearly and that he fights for them, for their future and for the good of all. I will write again as soon as I am able. Yours, with all my heart, Jack. Camp at Mwamba Crossing, Northern Rhodesia, 1st of September 1891. To Mrs. Margaret Thompson, Yorkshire, England. Dear Madam, it is with profound sorrow and the heaviest of hearts that I write you today. I regret that my words must carry such grief to your home, but it is my solemn duty to inform you of the passing of your husband, Jack, who fell in the line of duty during our efforts to protect the villages of the Luangwa Valley from the scourge of the man-eating lions. Jack gave his life valiantly in the defense of others. His courage and selflessness saved not only the village he fought to protect, but also countless lives that would have otherwise been lost to the terror that has plagued this region. He stood his ground against overwhelming odds, and in doing so, he displayed a bravery that will not be forgotten by those who owe him their lives. Please allow me to assure you that his sacrifice was not in vain. Jack's actions turned the tide of our campaign, giving us the means and time to finally end the threat of these terrible creatures. I can also tell you with complete sincerity that Jack saved my life on more than one occasion during this expedition. Without his steady hand, sharp mind, and fearless heart, I would not be writing this letter today. He was a good man, Mrs. Thompson, the very best of men. Arrangements have been made for his body to be repatriated to England at the earliest opportunity. The governor has authorized a generous dispensation to cover all costs associated with his return and funeral, so that he may be laid to rest with the dignity and honor he so richly deserves. Additionally, further support has been arranged to assist you and your family in this most difficult time. Though words may never ease the pain of such loss, I hope you will take some solace in the knowledge that your husband's sacrifice was made in the service of others, in defense of the innocent, and for the greater good. His actions were those of a hero, and his memory will endure not only in your hearts, but also in the hearts of those he saved. Should you wish, I would be honored to share more about his deeds and bravery during these dark days. He spoke often of you and the children, and it was clear that his love for you gave him strength in the face of danger. Please accept my deepest condolences and know that you and your family are in my prayers. Your humble servant, Charles E. Barclay. The story I'm about to tell you is a mixture of my own recollection and the memories of others from this period. This incident happened back when I was a little girl, so I didn't fully understand what was happening with my parents until it was fully explained to me many years later. But I guess it's no good telling you half a story, so I'll just fill in the blanks where possible too. My mom and dad were never meant to be a couple, and those are my mom's words, not mine. I know that might sound like a pretty messed up thing to say to your own daughter, and it always comes with the caveat that I was the silver lining to all those dark clouds, but it's kind of the truth. From what I've been told, my dad was a psychotic habitual drug user. And since my mom was a teenage alcoholic who was incapable of making good decisions for herself, they ended up dating and mom wound up getting pregnant with me. They had a rocky relationship from the start, but after I was born, things got increasingly and then exponentially worse for them. Dad was still using drugs, so to give us some kind of household income, he started selling them too. And that took up pretty much all of his time, so he was away from home a lot, which left my teenage mom all alone to drink, smoke dope, and try to raise a child. She had to learn from hard experience, and she said for a while there, she was so terrified of how I'd grow up that she'd cry herself to sleep at night. But eventually she scaled back the amount that she was drinking, stopped using drugs altogether, and kinda sorta got the hang of being a mom. Cut to the time I'm 7 years old, and instead of some crummy rundown 2-bedroom apartment my dad is dealing drugs from, we're living in a crummy rundown 2-bedroom suburban in another part of the city. My dad's working a steady job, but only really as cover for his nightly activities, which by then was brokering drug deals between local sellers and buying from other cities in the tri-state area. He didn't keep anything at the house, but he was still heavily involved in the business, and although he made a ton of money doing it, almost all of it was used to finance his own personal vices. My mom wanted him to quit, but he wouldn't, and they'd fallen completely out of love by that point, so all they'd do was argue or snap at each other on the rare occasion Dad was ever home. Then toward the end of 1983, Mom said that she wanted us to try Thanksgiving dinner, like an actual one, and not just fried chicken takeout from someplace. Well, long story short, Mom messed up the food, Dad started yelling at her because he'd taken time out from his activities to be there with us, and then Mom ended up relapsing hard by guzzling both bottles of wine that she'd bought and kept untouched for Dad. And by the time she started to yell back at my father, slurring and wobbling as she did, I ran up to my room like I usually did to hide until the yelling had stopped. Sometime later, I'm not sure how much time passed, but I decided that I wanted to head downstairs to get some snacks. Dinner had obviously been canceled, and although the anxiety had kept my appetite at bay for a while, it wasn't long before it kicked in with a vengeance. With my stomach growling, I made my way downstairs, and to get to my kitchen, I had to walk through the little TV room. I opened up the door, fairly confident the fighting had subsided because it was all quiet there, but as I did, I started to hear Mom groaning in a weird way while Dad was saying something to her in hushed tones. I kept on pushing the door until I could see them both. Mom was laying on her side on the couch while Dad was kneeling next to her, looking like he was trying to push something into her mouth, like a small piece of food or a pill. But when he pushed it into her mouth, he took a glass of water and made Mom drink from it until she swallowed. She coughed a few times, but Dad made sure that she got it down and then went about pushing another little pill into Mom's mouth. He made her swallow that one with water too, but then he did it over and over again before my stomach finally rumbled again and I was reminded of why I'd walked downstairs in the first place. And then I started walking through the TV room towards the kitchen. Mom and Dad used to do all kinds of weird stuff down there, so by age 7, I was kind of beyond questioning any of it. And most times when I walked through that room, my dad would either yell at me to get out or ignore me when he was too high to care. Only this time, when my dad noticed that I was walking through the room, he acted surprised, scared even, and then started explaining why he'd been giving Mommy pills. I told him all I wanted was to go get a snack because I was hungry, and then after he very uncharacteristically invited me to help myself to snacks and candy, he joined me in the kitchen and grabbed the biggest round-bottom cooking pan he could find, and then he went back into the room with it. As I walked back through with my snack and candy bars, Dad was supporting Mom as she leaned over and puked into the pan. He was rubbing her back and saying all kinds of very odd and nice things, but I remember how he stuck his fingers in her mouth at one point too. I thought it was maybe to get throw up out of her mouth because she didn't seem like she was fully awake. And now I know different. My dear old dad hadn't been trying to help my mom because she drank too much and made herself sick. He was trying to feed her so many pills that it would kill her. I don't know exactly what his plan was, and my mom doesn't know exactly what combination of pills he tried to give her either. but he certainly didn't plan on me walking in while it was happening. I guess he just tried to keep me calm and unquestioning at first, but when he realized that I might say something to the cops if I ever got questioned, he knew that he had to purge Mom's stomach of the pills before they took effect, and so that's what he did. Mom said she only realized what was happening because in the days after, it felt like she'd been swallowing broken glass. She went to take some pain meds for her very sore throat and then realized a bunch of medication bottles were missing. Dad played dumb and said that he didn't know what she was talking about, but he'd also failed to properly clean the carpet of Mom's vomit. She said that she kneeled down to sniff a patch of carpet just to make sure it wasn't her nose playing tricks on her, and that's when she saw a little white pill sitting under the couch. She'd obviously coughed or spat it out while Dad was force-feeding them to her. Then, in the rush to void her stomach, someone had knocked it under the couch. She was then able to figure out which kind of medication it was and then confronted my dad on where the rest of it had disappeared to. He then gave her some big sob story about how she'd done it to herself and that he'd been the one to save her. But Mom had long since figured out when Dad was lying to her and when he was telling the truth. She left not long after, with me in tow, which I guess is what Dad wanted, to get rid of us, but it was obviously reaching dangerously critical levels of wanting that to happen. If he was willing to hurt Mom, what would he have done with me? Would he have left me on the doorstep of an orphanage with a sign around my neck? Or would I have been the next one to have myself a little accident? Back in November of 2011, my girlfriend, Holly, invited me to Thanksgiving at her parents' place. We'd been seeing each other since February of that year, so it seemed about the right time to meet her folks. But then when I responded with a very enthusiastic yes, she told me it wouldn't be that kind of visit. It wasn't just going to be us and her parents. She was an only child. A bunch of other family members would be there, including her paternal grandpa and her paternal aunt. Her paternal grandpa was a weird old coot, didn't have a great relationship with her dad, and was always a source of tension during holiday get-togethers. But the reason she was really nervous that year, and the reason why she needed me there as, and these are the words she used, a service animal, was the presence of that paternal aunt, a lady who I'll just simply refer to as Janet. Her dad and grandpa didn't get along, but in the case of Aunt Janet, she and Holly's grandpa hadn't said so much as a word to each other in almost 20 years. To be fair, she hadn't spoken to much of anyone since she left town in her 20s, which was apparently sudden, without explanation, and under dubious circumstances. Starting up around the time Holly's grandma died, she kept in touch with her sisters here and there, but she hadn't been home to visit anyone in almost 2 decades. So to have her suddenly showing up again and showing interest in being around the family, it was a really big deal to Holly's mom and dad. As expected, Holly's grandpa had been dead against the idea of her coming to Thanksgiving dinner, but her dad was insistent. It was the first time Aunt Janet had asked to be around them in nearly 2 decades, so there was no way in hell he was about to turn down this first request, because who knew when they'd get another? Everyone acknowledged it was a potentially volatile situation, but being accustomed to such occurrences at everything from Christmases to 4th of July barbecues, Holly's dad felt the potential rewards were worth the risks. Some of Holly's relatives were optimistic, but it was an optimism she didn't share, and she made it abundantly clear that the event would most likely go horribly wrong, and since that wouldn't be particularly pleasant for me to witness, she said that she wouldn't hold it against me if I turned down the invitation. That was how Holly phrased it, but what I heard was if you put up with my dumb family, then it'll show that you're really serious about this relationship. And since I was getting pretty serious about our future together, it was like she'd thrown me a curveball I had a really good chance of knocking out of the park. Holly's parents lived in a really nice place over in North Jersey. It was a modern colonial with a regal-looking red brick facade and a welcoming porch supported by grand white columns. The front lawn and flower beds were perfectly maintained, and I'm pretty sure I saw a pool, hot tub, and barbecue pit in the backyard, each covered up for the winter. But it was only when I walked inside that I realized just how fancy the place really was. The entranceway consisted of a grand 2-story foyer with sweeping double staircase, gleaming chandelier, and polished hardwood floors. Holly had already told me that her parents made a lot of money, but their house had to be one of the nicest I've ever laid eyes on, and I say that as an avid watcher of those old MTV crib clips. There was a formal living room and dining room, both with coffered ceilings and oversized windows for this natural light, and then a cozy family room with a stone fireplace and brown leather couches. I could think of way worse places to spend Thanksgiving, even if I was about to witness a familial apocalypse. After being greeted by Holly's parents, we were directed into the family room, and since we'd arrived a little earlier than everyone else, I got to enjoy some one-on-one time with her dad. He seemed like a pretty okay guy, a little stern, but a lot more laid back than I expected him to be. Holly had always made her dad out to be this kind of drill sergeant figure, a man who dedicated himself to building his company and who had very little time for anyone else. Holly had always made her dad out to be this kind of drill sergeant figure, a man who dedicated himself to building his company and who had very little time for anyone else. However, once he seemed happy that I wasn't a total douchebag intent on breaking his daughter's heart, he warmed up to me considerably. Holly and her mom brought through some hot apple cider, and we talked a little more before the rest of her relatives began to arrive. A few cousins showed up with aunts and uncles, and then one of her mom's old college friends showed up with her husband. Her grandpa was one of the last people to show up, and when he did, you felt the atmosphere immediately shift from joyful to mildly tense. Holly's grandpa seemed like a real grouchy guy, and I saw two of her aunts go into full-on people-pleasing mode in an attempt to manage the tension and avoid conflict. Grandpa seemed happy to see his daughters, but it was a lukewarm kind of happy. Holly's dad got a stern handshake and a very joyless, good to see you, son. But upon first glance, it didn't seem like he and Grandpa would be at each other's throats. I pointed this out to Holly and then mentioned how maybe that year might buck the trend in terms of family conflict. And she responded with a shake of her head and assured me that what I was seeing was most likely the calm before the storm. In her experience, the tension would inevitably ramp up throughout the course of the afternoon, and then add the return of the prodigal aunt into the mix, and she had a gut feeling that she'd be needing my support by early evening. And like I said, Holly's grandpa seemed stern, like father, like son, but unlike her dad, he didn't seem remotely interested in breaking the ice. When I was introduced as his granddaughter's boyfriend, he seemed completely disinterested and asked Holly's mom why I was there if I wasn't family. Then, when she tried to explain, he dismissed her with a wave of his hand. It was obnoxious in the extreme, but I'd been warned of how much of an a-hole he could be, so it's not like I felt wounded when he treated me so rudely. Actually, it was kind of a relief. I didn't give a crap about what her weird old grandpa had to say. If my potential future mother and father-in-law were chilled, then that was all I cared about. Holly's grandpa could go off, and sure, it'd be pretty unpleasant in the moment, but if things got a little too crazy, I'd be there to drive her home and make sure that she got the support that she needed. And after that, I was quite sure that the whole thing would be forgotten about in like a week, or maybe a month, or however long it took, and it'd be like it had never even happened in the first place. But when the incident did come, it wasn't some run-of-the-mill family yelling match. It was bigger, more frantic, and more frightening than anything I could have ever imagined. And so once I had the meeting with Holly's grouchy grandpa out of the way, I was feeling pretty good about the rest of the afternoon. He'd been making comments about me all day, about how I shouldn't have been there, about how they shouldn't be letting me date Holly, but literally everyone seemed chill except him, so it just became a case of staying out of his way and ignoring his jabs, and everything would go relatively smoothly. The only other real test the get-together had to endure was the arrival of Holly's Aunt Janet. Less than an hour before we all sat down for dinner, Aunt Janet arrived at Holly's parents' place. She was the oldest of her siblings, but looked pretty good for her age and showed up carrying what looked like some kind of portfolio bag, the kind artists use to transport their paintings from place to place. Aunt Janet and her siblings had talked while she was away, so it wasn't like it was their first time talking to her in 20 years. but it was still a profoundly emotional affair. There was a lot of hugging, a few tears, and Aunt Janet was even swapping greetings with her long-estranged father without incident. So even that late in the day, I was convinced that I dodged a major bullet and that everything might turn out all right. Janet and her sisters were sort of entrenched in catching up for about an hour while Holly's grandpa and some of the other guys watched football in pretty much next to silence, until finally, Holly's mom called us all to dinner. Holly was Italian on her mom's side, so in addition to most of the usual Thanksgiving stuff, there were things like shrimp cocktails, baked clams, and even a charcuterie board. Then instead of mashed potatoes or candied yams, her mom served baked ziti with her butter-basted turkey along with roasted Brussels sprouts and string beans sautéed in garlic and olive oil. And everything she put down on the table was absolutely incredible, and primarily most of the reason I remember most of it. And so much so that once everything was dolled out, the whole table quit talking for a solid 10 minutes and we just stuffed our faces until conversation slowly started up again. Everyone was focused on how good the food was, at least until after dinner when topics started to meander and Holly's father and aunt started to reminisce about their childhood. Aunt Janet stayed quiet for the most part, and then while Holly's mom started to clear the table after dessert had been served, Janet volunteered to help her. We talked amongst ourselves for a while, then once people started to try and get up from the table and do their own thing, Janet reappeared with that portfolio bag in her hand. She politely asked everyone to take a seat again because she wanted to host an after-dinner parlor game for us, as a thank you for being such gracious hosts. Everyone seemed pretty excited. Then once we'd all returned to our seats, Janet announced that she'd liked everyone at the table to partake in a game of word association. She'd been gone for such a long time and, by her own admission, hadn't kept up to date with everyone nearly as much as she should have. So what better way to start the process of catching up than with a friendly, non-competitive game of word association? When Aunt Janet said parlor game, I figured that she just meant like charades or something. But when it came to word association, I didn't understand where the challenge actually was, and apparently neither did Holly's grandpa. He started up by asking something like, "The goddamn point of all of this?" but was quickly silenced by Holly's dad, who told him to be polite and allow Janet to host the game that she had planned. Everyone went quiet, and then Janet grabbed the large portfolio bag and revealed it to contain a portable whiteboard complete with legs to stand on. Now, these sort of expectant looks were exchanged on account of how well prepared she was, and at first, people were confused but excited. Then, after pulling out a marker from the whiteboard's carry bag, Aunt Janet began to write. The first word that she wrote on the whiteboard was school. Aunt Janet then went around the room asking for words or phrases people associated with school. My own personal answer was lunch, but she also got answers like teacher, homework, football team, and other things of that nature. Aunt Janet did the same thing with the word boathouse, then the word bear, and then finally she sort of surveyed all of our thought associations with the word truth. By the time she was done, Janet had written 4 big prompt words on the board along with dozens of smaller words leading off from the larger words, kind of like a mind map. She then put the cap back on the pen and then took a step back from the board and asked us all what we saw. Seeing as none of us could tell if her question was rhetorical or not, everyone stayed quiet and waited for the answer. And Janet wasted no time in telling us. She pointed to all the answers we'd given and told us that they were all kinds of answers that regular people give, whereas all her own answers were considerably different. Janet said that when she thought of the word school, she thought of the word sick, and that was due to all the sick days that she'd taken whilst in elementary school. I remember thinking, where's she going with this exactly? But then right after she said that last thing, Janet turned to Holly's grandpa and says, "You remember all those sick days too, don't you, Dad? But I was never really sick, was I? At least not for the most times you called the school and told them I was too sick to attend." There was this sort of discomfort across the dining table, and Holly's grandpa grumbled something about not knowing what she was talking about. But then Aunt Janet says, "Oh, you don't? You sure about that, Dad? You sure you got no idea what I'm talking about? Well, how's about this next word? boathouse. Aunt Janet then said that whenever she saw or thought of the word boathouse, she didn't think of fishing trips or lakeside vacations. She thought of the pain she'd suffered one summer when she was a kid. She went on to describe how when Holly's father was just a baby, the family had gone on a vacation in upstate New York. Janet had ended up misbehaving somehow, and Holly's grandpa had dragged her away from the lake and into a friend's boathouse for a stern talking to. But a stern talking to was not all she got. Janet claimed the punishment that she was given was a far cry from anything considered acceptable between father and daughter, and that the pain that she felt afterwards was so fierce that she couldn't sit down without her tummy hurting. Again, Holly's grandpa grumbled something about having no memory of the event, and everyone else stayed very quiet. Aunt Janet then pointed to the word bear, and then to a few of our more innocent associations. We'd said things like grizzly and teddy bear, and while Janet also associated the word with the small, stuffed, and cuddly variety, her further associations were not positive ones. Janet said that she associated teddy bears with distraction, delusion, even disassociation, because it was her teddies that her father told her to cuddle whenever he did things no father should ever be doing to their daughter. There was a straight-up gasp when she said that, and no one dared to get up from their chairs, and as Holly's grandpa began to yell about Janet being a crazy C-word, Janet shrieked over him so loud that everyone, including Grandpa, was silenced. That's when she pointed to the word truth, and although I definitely won't quote her verbatim because I'm quite confident it'll get your channel a strike or a warning or something of that nature, this is roughly what she said. Janet said that whenever she thought of the word truth, she felt that she'd been robbed of any positive association. Other people heard or read that word and it gave them hope for a sense of order and justice in the world. When she thought of the word truth, it was like a dagger in her gut. It hurt because for her whole life, she'd wondered if anyone would ever believe the truth of what her own father did to her when she was growing up. And even if she did one day find the courage to talk about it, she wondered how in the world a person goes about announcing something like that. Well, apparently, Janet had plenty of time to think about it. Then when she finally made up her mind and had the perfect method of delivery planned out, she called up Holly's dad and asked if she could attend Thanksgiving that year. And by the time Janet had finally finished her speech, people were either sobbing or just completely filled with shock. Then as she asked Holly's grandpa to say something, anything, he went from completely ashen and silent to filled with rage. He screamed at Janet, but Janet screamed right back at him. Holly's aunts were crying while her dad looked like he was on the verge of a mental breakdown. All of the people that weren't immediate family excused themselves and headed for the door the minute things started flying off the handle. I just remember reaching for Holly's hand and holding it. She looked like she was on the verge of catatonia, pale and wide-eyed, like her mind was struggling to compute what she had just heard. And I kept telling her, "We can leave if you want to," but she wouldn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on Janet and her grandpa, who suddenly rose from her chair and walked off toward the kitchen. Janet yelled something to him, and then when she appeared to run out of steam, she turned and walked towards her whiteboard and began packing it into its case, soundtracked by the sobbing of her sisters. It was probably one of the more surreal experiences of my entire life. Seeing the breakdown of a family like that would be emotionally intense at the very best of times, but to have such a sickening 30-year-old secret divulged like that was the kind of drama I've only ever seen in movies or TV. In those situations, people are glued to what they're seeing on screen. But then in real life, it's like I wanted the ground to just open up and swallow me so I didn't have to bear witness to any more mind-shattering heartbreak. I really did want nothing more than to get out of there, but there was no leaving without Holly. Wherever she went, I went, and for better or for worse. At first, it didn't look like Holly's grandpa was going to re-enter the dining room, and I don't think anyone had wanted him there either. I got the impression that with Holly's dad and aunts, the abuse of their elder sister and at the hands of their father was something they'd long suspected but never had confirmed. The shock only lasted a minute or two. what came next was this very deep, resounding grief, like they'd always known and had just never wanted to accept it. And after all, Holly's grandpa had barely said a word in his own defense, but then seconds later, he reappeared in the dining room's doorway with one hand held firmly behind his back. From where I was sitting, I couldn't see what Grandpa was concealing, but as he walked across the room and approached Aunt Janet, Holly's dad caught a glimpse of what he was holding and jumped from his chair. He yelled, "Dad, no!" and then threw himself across the room at him, just as Holly's grandpa raised a kitchen knife above his head. I don't think he'd have actually been able to stab Aunt Janet because she saw it coming way early and jumped back as Holly's dad grabbed Grandpa's arm. Grandpa was a man possessed. Like you could see it in his eyes that he'd completely lost his mind, but he was old and slow. While Holly's dad was still relatively fast but much, much stronger. And within seconds, Holly's dad had Grandpa restrained and Aunt Janet was walking out of the house while yelling assurances that no one would ever see her again. Not long after Janet left, and with Grandpa being sort of sequestered in another room, Holly decided it was finally time to leave. She stayed quiet the whole drive home, stayed in bed for almost a week afterwards, and ignored phone calls from just about everyone except me and a handful of her friends. She didn't want to talk about what had happened. In fact, we broke up long before I ever got the chance to really discuss things with her, or rather before there came a time when she was comfortable talking about it. And I don't blame her either. If that was me, I wouldn't even want to believe it, let alone be able to summon the strength to talk about it. And so despite seeing her family's breakdown up close, I never found out what happened in either the immediate or long-term aftermath. I still think about Holly quite often, even all these years later. I wonder how she's doing, and if her family ever found peace. I've sometimes thought about reaching out to her just to see how she's doing, but something tells me I'll only be a painful reminder of the single worst day of her life. Hi, let's read. This story was shared with me by my late grandfather, who has long since passed away. He used to tell it to us as kids, sitting by the fire on cold, quiet nights. At the time, we thought it was just one of his wild tales meant to entertain us. After his passing, I found his journal among his things, and there it was, written down by his own hand. Now, reading it gave me chills all over again, as I always thought these were just fantasies in his head. But now I'm sharing it with you exactly as told to me because I think it deserves to be remembered. So thank you for sharing if you do. Long ago, back in the summer of 1925, I applied for a job as a game warden on a large country estate. I'd grown up in rural England, and as a boy I'd spent countless hours walking the local woods and fields and learning the habits of game birds, deer, and other wildlife. I had and still have a huge passion for the great British countryside, and so with that in hand, I approached the estate manager of the nearby Capsthorne Hall. I handed Mr. Wilkinshaw a letter of recommendation from the local rector, a man who'd known me since I was a boy. Back in those days, character counted just as much as ability, but the letter didn't appear to sway Mr. Wilkinshaw in the least bit. He told me that being a game warden was no job for a young man such as myself, and that even if I was bullheaded enough to disagree, Capsthorne Hall wasn't the place for me to start. I tried to plead my case, but Mr. Walkinshaw was steadfast in his dismissal, at least until I'd turned my back on him and walked away a few steps. It was then that he called after me and told me if I was serious about working with him, I should return the next morning and after rethinking my proposal. Well, I thought about it and decided that I still fancied life as a game warden. And so back I went the next morning to talk to Mr. Walkinshaw. Impressed at my return, Mr. Walkinshaw invited me to partake in an on-the-stop interview, which thankfully was far from formal. He took me on a walk across the grounds, quizzing me on my knowledge of wildlife and how I'd handle trespassers or poachers. I had to demonstrate that I could recognize the tracks of different game animals and predict their movements. Then, as for the areas of knowledge I was lacking in, Mr. Walkinshaw assured me that he'd fill in the gaps. I'd receive ample instruction on the handling, maintenance, and use of firearms. I'd also be taught how to track a poacher's path, how to mend a broken pheasant pen, and how to set snares or traps with precision. However, once I had proven my competence, Mr. Walkinshaw informed me that perhaps the most important factor wasn't my proficiency, it was how much I could be trusted. The landowners often entertained guests for hunts, and it was vital to ensure their enjoyment without any disruption or violation of their privacy. I assured them that I could do the job quietly and efficiently, and that the lord of the manor's private business was of no interest to me whatsoever. Then, and only then, was I offered the position, which came with accommodation in the form of a small cottage on the edge of the estate. My duties began immediately, checking the pheasant pens, repairing fences, setting traps for foxes, and patrolling the grounds after dark. It was solitary work, but I got a great deal of satisfaction from it, ensuring the game thrived and that the estate remained secure. It became a matter of personal pride for me. But at the same time, the job wasn't without its challenges. Poachers were a constant threat, and dealing with them required firmness and tact. But in those early days, I relished the responsibility and the rhythm of life and service to the land. But reality was, I labored in ignorance of Mr. Walkinshaw's rather cryptic warning, as well as the estate's true nature. It was a clear, quiet night in the late autumn, the kind where the air is still balmy, but the faint rustle of leaves can carry for miles. I was doing my usual rounds, patrolling the far edges of the estate near the woods that bordered the nearby moors. The pheasants had been restless that week, and I suspected a fox had been prowling close to their pens. So, with my lantern casting a soft golden glow ahead of me and my shotgun rested comfortably in the crook of my arm, I carefully and silently patrolled while keeping my ears and eyes peeled. As I approached the old oak tree near the gamekeeper's path, I heard an unnatural sound coming through the trees. It wasn't the stealthy padding of a fox or the quick dart of a hare, but rather a low, guttural growl that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It came from the deeper part of the woods, beyond where my lantern could reach, and the moment I heard it, I paused, my grip tightening on the shotgun. And then I saw it, just beyond the trees where the shadows grew thick. At first it looked like a man crouched low on the ground, but there was something about the way it moved, something that seemed wrong to me. Its shoulders were hunched and too broad, while its limbs seemed far too long to be those of a fox or even a deer. The moonlight caught its eyes, reflecting a yellow gleam that sent a shiver through me. It sniffed the air, and I could see the glint of sharp teeth and a mouth that seemed too large for any human face. My instinct told me to retreat, but my duty held me fast. Poachers I could deal with, predators too. But this was something else entirely. I raised my shotgun, calling out, "Who's there?" with my voice sounding steadier than I felt. The figure straightened, and that's when I saw its full height, taller than any man, with a body covered in coarse, dark fur. Its hands, or claws, whatever they were, hung at its side, long and sharp, and as my eyes found them, I began to question the strength of my shotgun. It stepped forward, slowly and deliberately, and I fell rooted to the spot. Was it a man in some terrible costume, an animal disfigured by disease? I asked 1,000 questions in just a few short seconds, but no answer satisfied my terror. Its growl deepened, reverberating in my chest like thunder. I raised the shotgun, then fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed through the woods, startling a flock of roosting birds into flight, but the creature didn't flinch. Instead, it let out a bone-chilling howl that started low but rose into a piercing wail. My heart pounded. I took a step back, and then another, and another. Thankfully, the creature advanced no further and instead stood its ground, watching me with eyes that glowed in the bright silvery moonlight. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it turned, dropped back down to all fours, and then melted into the shadows of the trees. I stood there for what felt like hours, my breathing ragged and my shotgun trembling in my hands. Then when I finally found the courage to move, I walked briskly back to the estate, lantern swinging wildly at my side. The usual sounds of the woods unnervingly absent. The night felt heavier. I was not alone. The next morning I approached Mr. Walkinshaw and informed him of my nocturnal encounter. I had assumed his reaction would be incredulous, that he'd accuse me of drinking on the job or having far too fanciful an imagination. Yet he seemed so unsurprised by my report that I began to feel very unsettled. He told me that he too had experienced nocturnal encounters with such a beast, but that it was no threat to him or anyone else working at the estate. He said that, in a manner of speaking, the creature was Lord Capesthorne's pet, and that its ilk had called the estate home for centuries. Any encounter with one of the beasts was sure to put the fear of God into a man, yet he assured me that slaying it would bring untold woe to the estate and its holders. Trusting in his experience and expertise, I took Mr. Walkinshaw's word to heart. But every time I patrolled that part of the estate after dark, I carried a heavier lantern and extra shells, and a prayer whispered under my breath. Whatever that thing was, beast, man, or nightmare, it reminded me that some corners of the wild still belong to the unknown. A few years back, I drove over to my parents' place to spend Thanksgiving with them and our extended family. As I stepped out of my car, I remember smelling the smoke of burning log fires drifting on the breeze, and it was like stepping through a time machine. I don't know about you, but there's something really special about that time of year when all the different smells and sensations of late fall can take you right back to being a kid again. But I wasn't a kid anymore, far from it in fact. I had taken my place as the unmarried uncle, showing up halfway through the day after spending the morning at work. The driveway of my parents' house was lined with cars, and as I walked towards the front door, I could already hear the swirls of conversation and laughter coming from inside. After knocking on the door, my mom appeared on the entrance, and as she welcomed me inside, a wave of warmth and rich aromas hit my face. The combined scent of roast turkey and spiced pies and something unmistakably buttery hung thick in the air. And then as Mom pulled me in for a big hug, I truly felt at home. After we swapped a little small talk regarding the weather and the drive over, Mom walked me into a living room alive with activity and then announced my arrival. My cousins were sprawled across the couches, looking away from their football game for just the briefest of moments to greet me with raised beer bottles. A few of the kids were sitting on the floor between them, holding plates of snacks and chattering amongst themselves, and it was amazing to see how much they've grown. In the kitchen, a few of my aunts and uncles sat around the dinner table sipping glasses of wine. Even more children darted in and out as my mom made her way to the stove, joined by an aunt who started stirring and tasting and then passing notes back to Mom. It was loud, messy, and in my mind, perfect. It felt like Thanksgiving and it felt like home. I asked my mom if that was everyone, as in everyone who was due to show up for dinner, and she said that we were only waiting on one other person to show up, and that person was Uncle Tony. My Uncle Tony was still considered the baby among his siblings and was only around 10 years older than myself at the time, so early 40s. He was a pretty unremarkable guy, close to my grandpa but quiet and mostly kept to himself. I lived out of town, but Uncle Tony lived out of state, so every family holiday, he'd make the 4-hour drive across state lines and was usually the last to join us. Personally, I was always figured that he deliberately timed his journey to coincide with dinner being less than an hour from the table. He was never a particularly outgoing person, so I figured all the small talk and catching up with distant relatives was a bit of a headache for him. He'd show up before dinner, eat his fill, and then relax with us for a few hours while everyone was too full of turkey to say anything to each other. But then that year, it looked like he was cutting things a little too close for comfort. About a half hour before Mom was set to ring the dinner bell, she asked me to text Uncle Tony for his estimated time of arrival, and I figured he'd be driving, so I didn't expect his immediate response, but when dinner was only around 5 minutes from the table, Mom asked me to give him a call to check where he was. I called once, but it went to voicemail. I then called a second time, but it didn't ring as long as before the call went to his answering machine, and I figured that was a sign of life since him declining the call meant that he was probably only a few blocks away. He also wouldn't want to risk a ticket by, talking on the wheel or something on a day when the cops are pretty much just dying to bag themselves a few drunks or bad drivers to make holiday examples out of. I told all that to my mom, but she was still very concerned, so she had me calling my Uncle Tony on repeat while she got everyone to the table. She then asked me to sort of help deal with dishes and serving plates to everyone at the table, but once we'd all sat down to eat, she kept checking her phone and complaining that Tony wasn't responding to messages. All the adults who knew him checked their phones just in case he sent somebody a message that they hadn't seen yet. But when they didn't see any notifications from him, they just began consuming their food. And no one seemed all that worried about Tony at first, but it wasn't because they didn't care. He was always the last to show up and did so by that small margin that I talked about earlier, so they figured that he'd just run into a little bit of traffic or something and would be there within the hour. And so by the time we'd all finished our bowls of pumpkin pie and hand-whipped vanilla cream and all that good stuff, Uncle Tony still hadn't shown up, and neither had he called or texted to let us know where he was. A few of us started calling and texting him again, only this time with very added concern. It was my phone that his name first flashed across, as it buzzed with an incoming text message notification, but despite what I read being totally innocuous, it was somehow oddly unsettling too. Uncle Tony had texted me, but all his message read was, "Hi." It's hard to articulate what I felt in the moments that followed. Getting that single word message was so out of character that I think I instinctively knew something was wrong with Uncle Tony from the moment I read it. However, as I tried to figure out how to properly convey my concern, I stayed quiet, just long enough to hear the phones of my relatives begin to buzz with their own incoming messages. They came in at a rate of about one every 10 to 15 seconds, but one by one, my aunts, uncles, mother, and father all got single-word messages that simply read, "Hi." It was one of my uncles that got the first message as he read it out loud for everyone to hear. There were a few moments of confusion as people wondered why he might send such a very weird message when he was almost 90 minutes late for dinner. And then right as the concern started to register on their faces, my mom tapped her phone, put it to her ear, and waited for my Uncle Tony to answer her call. When he once again failed to pick up, we all started sending him messages mostly along the lines of, "Are you okay? Pick up the phone. Call us when you can." I was the first to receive a reply. "Hope I haven't left you all waiting, lol," it read. It was completely inconsistent with Uncle Tony's usual style of texting, and knowing the person on the other end wouldn't answer any calls, I found myself texting, "Who is this?" The reply came in seconds and simply read, "Thumbelina." Knowing I probably wasn't going to get anything useful out of them, I decided to ask one more question before calling the cops. I texted, "Where's Tony?" Then when the reply came, I had to struggle to keep a straight face as I got up from the table. I told everyone I was going to call a friend of his just in case he passed out drunk and they were texting from his phone as a prank or something. It was a dumb excuse. Everyone knew that wasn't like Uncle Tony to get blackout drunk like that, and had appropriately confused expressions as I got up from the table and walked into the kitchen. But honestly, I couldn't think of anything else to say. All my brain power was focused on maintaining this complete poker face, not freaking the heck out, because in response to my messages of "Where's Tony?", whoever had this phone had texted me back, "I don't know, but there will be no more Thanksgivings where he's going, ha 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 ha." The first thing I did when I walked into the kitchen was call the cops. One of my uncles followed and soon figured out that I wasn't talking to Uncle Tony's friend. We tried to keep the news from spreading, but the rest of the adults soon figured out something was wrong when whoever had Tony's phone started texting them similarly creepy stuff. After that, the mood in the house began to sharply decline, but everyone managed to keep from totally panicking or displaying too much of any other emotion, at least until all the kids were either upstairs or on their way home from their parents. And after that, all bets were off, and my mom and aunt were fanning themselves in between bouts of sobbing, praying this whole thing was just some sick joke. But sadly, it wasn't. By the time I placed the 911 call in my mom's kitchen, the cops had already found my Uncle Tony. He was sitting in his car, which was parked in the parking lot of a closed-up business, and he was leaned up against the steering wheel with a bullet hole through his head. They found his phone just a few hours later, in the hands of a girl sitting in a diner only a few miles from where Tony's car was found. She'd cut off his thumb so she could keep unlocking his phone every time she wanted to use it, and although she could have used it to do just about anything, she chose to taunt the relatives of the man she just shot through the head on the way to a family Thanksgiving. And from what I understand, the whole thing was a pretty open and shut case. The girl was so crazy that when the cops arrived to arrest her, she insisted on finishing off a text message before they put her in cuffs. She didn't get to send it, but she was in the process of typing on a message to one of Tony's coworkers, gloating about how he'd never get to see him again. I think she spent about 5 minutes with psychiatrists before they declared the girl to be completely and utterly out of her mind. She was detained at the hospital and has been there ever since. The cops later said that they figured that she was some type of hitchhiker, and since she was young, small of stature, and generally disarming in appearance, Uncle Tony had most likely offered to give her a ride someplace. But that is something that never, ever sat right with us. Like I said earlier, Tony was a very reserved kind of guy, possibly to the point that you might call him selfish. There's no way he'd have stopped to give anyone a ride, not unless they were in serious life or death kind of trouble. He'd rather forego the human interaction, and Mom said he was like that since pretty much forever. So we've all kind of wondered just what happened for him to pull over and let that girl into his car, because it wouldn't be like any Uncle Tony we knew to put himself at risk like that, not unless something was very, very wrong. From 2009 to 2017, I served as an infantryman in the British Army's Duke of Lancaster's regiment. I applied to join just before my 22nd birthday, and to be honest, I really didn't know what I was getting myself into. But after the initial shock of training, I found it was exactly what I was looking for. I won't bore you with all the cliches about the camaraderie or the spiritual satisfaction that duty brings, because for me, it was the structure I enjoyed the most. I had a terrible time in school. So much so that my mom and dad thought that I had a problem with authority. They thought I was mental for even considering the army and said I'd be thrown out within a week. But when the staff training you have all been to Iraq and Afghanistan 2 or 3 times apiece and actually been in combat, it's a lot easier to pay them the respect they demand. And so, just a few months of training, I went from a dickhead layabout with a reputation for getting myself into trouble to an infantry soldier, fit for service in one of the finest armed forces in the world. I joined a little bit too late to see Iraq, but I ended up going to Afghanistan for 6 months over 2013 to 2014 as part of an Afghan Army mentoring team, or OMLET. Soldiering was my life. I didn't want to do anything else, and I could see myself pushing 50 and retiring as some crusty old sergeant with a big fat pension and plenty of time for golf and the grandkids. But as the saying goes, God laughs at those who make plans. In my 8th year of service, so just after I turned 30 in 2017, there was an accident during a training exercise in Wales and I suffered a pretty severe back injury. I did some rehab for a while and I suspected that I'd be medically discharged, but the notice came and I was devastated. I put so much faith in the rehab process that I hadn't mentally prepared myself for the worst to happen. So once I was out of the army, I just felt lost. I worked 4 different jobs in the year after I got out. I'd work somewhere for a few months, get sick to my back teeth of the job and the people, and then move on to something else, hoping the results might be different. I found the work dull. I had sawed-all respect for most of my bosses, and most of my colleagues were a major pain in the arse, but no matter where I went, it'd be the same routine every single time. Get job, get bored, get shut. But then finally, I got a phone call from an old mate who was still in the regiment. He knew that I was having a rough time in the civilian job market, but he also said that he might just have the solution for me, and that solution came in the form of a very unique employment opportunity. The Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC, is one of the most war-torn countries on Earth, and since 1950, it's been embroiled in 7 major civil conflicts. The near non-stop violence means that vast swaths of the country are now lawless and are completely at the mercy of rebel militias or criminal gangs. These groups are often indistinguishable from one another, both in appearance and in their method of violence. But they both have something else in common, in that they both found a truly diabolical way of financing their operations: the poaching of rare and endangered African animals. In the early 2010s, the situation in one of the DRC's national parks got so bad that the country basically begged the international community for help. In Virunga National Park, poachers were killing rare birds, reptiles, antelopes, even hippos for their teeth. But the thing that really caused international outcry was when they started targeting the elephants and gorillas. Virunga is one of the few remaining habitats of the critically endangered mountain gorilla, so when conservationists noticed that they were being shot, caught, or killed in poachers' traps, they were devastated. African forest elephants are also critically endangered, so when the poachers started killing them just to hack off their tusks and leg it, global wildlife charities reacted in a similarly furious fashion. And in the end, the European Union decided to set up what's called the Virunga Foundation, which took its entire African conservation budget and poured it into the defense of Virunga National Park. The foundation inflated the park's budget by around 80%, and then essentially took responsibility for both the park's conservation efforts and its overall security. They employed dozens of additional park rangers and supplied them with small arms, and then, after only the most minimal of training, would send them out to deter poachers and evict illegal farmers from the boundaries of the park. However, while the Rangers' initial efforts proved effective, it drove the poachers into an ad hoc alliance with a group of armed rebels known as the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, or for short, the FDLR. In late 2015, when a group of Rangers and government soldiers attempted to evict one of the last illegal farmers in Virunga, they were ambushed by a team of poachers and FDLR fighters. When the smoke had cleared, 15 soldiers and 1 park ranger laid dead. And in a bid to preserve human life and at the direction of both the foundation and the Congolese government, the rangers ceded ground to the poachers and rebels. They hoped the move might put an end to the violence in Virunga, but they were wrong. In August of 2017, 5 park rangers were attacked while on a routine patrol near Lake Edward. They were first pinned down by a sniper firing from a distant tree line, and then as they struggled to escape, assault teams descended on them from 2 opposing directions. Ranger HQ sent a reaction force of rangers and Congolese soldiers to relieve them, but one by one, the rangers' radios fell silent, and by the time the reaction force reached their position, all 5 rangers were dead. And the same thing happened just a few months later during the spring of 2018 when 5 more rangers and a Congolese army driver were ambushed and killed. And this brought the total number of murdered rangers to a shocking 175. But, as in so many other similar situations, it didn't become critical until the region's tourism was affected. In May of 2018, 2 young British tourists named Bethan Davies and Robert Jesty were on a tour of Virunga when they were spotted by a group of rebels. The ranger charged with guiding them, a 25-year-old named Rachel Baraka, attempted to defend them, but was killed almost immediately as the rebels attacked their position. After a period of negotiation, along with rumors that an SAS hostage rescue team was en route to Virunga, Bethan and Robert were eventually released. But their kidnapping meant that in June of 2018, Virunga had to be closed until the safety of visitors could be ensured. And this, boys and girls, is how my job opportunity arose. And by the summer of 2018, almost every citizen of Eastern Congo knew exactly how dangerous it was to take a job as a ranger. Reports regarding ranger casualties were being widely and frequently published, and it was common knowledge that taking on the poachers and rebels meant doing so with minimal equipment and manpower. In so many words, Becoming a Virunga Park Ranger was practically a death sentence, so as you can imagine, their recruitment levels dropped off dramatically. At least until they brought in the requirements and extended an invitation to international applicants. If you had any experience as an infantry soldier, the Virunga Foundation was offering very generous pay packets to anyone willing to help train and mentor the ranger teams. As I mentioned earlier, being on that Afghan omelet team meant that I had the exact expertise that they were looking for. It would be dangerous work, and there was every chance that I'd end up getting shot at. But for me, hearing that only sealed the deal. By some bizarre twist of fate, I had a golden opportunity to carry on soldiering, and you can bet your bottom dollar that I grabbed hold of that opportunity with both hands, like a chimp ripping its owner's face off. And just a few weeks after getting that phone call from my mate in the regiment, I was boarding a plane at Manchester Airport, bound for Eastern Congo. 18 hours later, I landed at Goma Airport at around 4 a.m. local time, then met up with my contact in the arrivals lounge. When I was first told about the former Green Beret, whose job it was to orientate international recruits, I pictured some Chuck Norris look-alike who ate bullets, pissed petrol, and crapped rolls of barbed wire. But when I walked into the arrivals lounge, the bloke holding the sign with my name on it looked more like a cross between Jim Morrison and Charles Manson. And I remember thinking, there's no way this guy is ex-Special Ops. But then, the more we talked, the more I realized that he was every bit as legit as he'd been made out to be. His name was Jason, but everyone called him Top because he retired as a first sergeant. He was also the top guy when it came to international recruits, so I suppose taking his title as a moniker just made things easier for people. He was in his 40s, had shoulder-length graying brown hair that was receding up top, and then a bushy coppery beard that was a silvery gray around his chin. With his bead bracelets, lion claw necklace, and tea-shade glasses, he resembled some kind of New Age safari tourist. But the lingo he used, the way he carried himself, and the fact that he was almost fluent in the local language all made me think, yeah, this bloke's the real deal. From Goma Airport, we traveled by minibus to a much smaller airstrip in the southern section of Virunga National Park. The journey took around 2 hours, giving Top and I plenty of time to get acquainted after he filled me in on what to expect. We'd be flying over Lake Edward before landing at a ranger base camp at a place called Ishango. There, I joined several other foreign volunteers in training and mentoring the rangers. But most importantly, I'd also be going on patrol with them, and going on patrol meant getting into scraps. Top made that abundantly clear to me. If I went on patrol, there wasn't merely a chance that I'd be exchanging fire with poachers or rebels. It was a certainty. And after arriving at the airstrip and taking to the skies in a small single-engine air taxi, I got a lesson in just how enormous Africa really is. For scale, the largest lake in England is Lake Windermere at 5.7 square miles, and comparatively, the largest lake in Scotland is Loch Lomond, which clocks in at a whopping 27 square miles. But then Lake Edward, which separates the northern and southern portions of Virunga National Park, has a jaw-dropping surface area of 897 square miles. At one point, while we were flying over it in what amounted to a rusty tin bucket with a propeller attached, it looked like we were out at sea, flying across the friggin' Atlantic or something. You could only barely see land off to our left, and the invisible shores off to our right were so far away that they weren't even in the Congo anymore. They were in Rwanda. Top and our pilot seemed to find a great deal of amusement at how anxious I was. I'm ex-Army, not ex-RAF, but flying over Lake Edward was smooth sailing compared to our landing at Ishango. It was still early morning when I arrived, but the camp was alive with activity. In one corner, nestled among some trees, were a grouping of small homes occupied by the 24 rangers which were permanently stationed there. The much newer volunteer accommodation was about 100 feet away on the other side of the solar panels which supplied most of our electricity. There was a mess hall, sanitation pits, wash facilities, and an armory, along with medical facilities, a comm center, and even a football pitch the blokes used for recreation. I remember being impressed by what amounted to a pretty decent setup, one that was much better than any of the forward operating bases I'd seen in Afghanistan. But what I was really excited to do was meet some of the lads I'd be working with. The first, and probably the bloke that I spent the most time with, was an Irishman. I'll just call him Paddy. Now, Paddy wasn't his real name, but as an Irish Army reservist, he didn't have the proper permission to take part in a foreign conflict. And that meant, should the Irish Army have found out what he was doing, he could have potentially gotten himself into a fair bit of trouble. He was a great soldier, a good lad, loved the crack, as they say, and he was a huge fan of English football too, so that gave us plenty to talk about right away. Then there was the ginger lad from Texas with a backward name. Everyone called him Tanner, which I assumed was his last name, but then his full name turned out to be Tanner Scott. I asked him if some sort of mistake had been made on his birth certificate, because surely his name should have been Scott Tanner, but surprisingly, he couldn't see the joke. What he could do, on the other hand, was shoot the arse off a fly at 300 yards, which meant that I didn't give a toss my jokes didn't land, as long as shots like that did. Then there was Manu, the French bloke, who said that he'd fought in Malia before hearing about the plight of the Virunga Rangers. And then there was Nick, another American who was a massive animal lover and Tanner's polar opposite in almost every conceivable way. They had their fair share of disagreements, but there was a mutual respect between the two of them, so they worked well as a team. But perhaps the most intriguing of all the blokes on my training team was Yuri. Yuri was an absolute unit of a man, who looked a bit like the bloke Jason Momoa played in Game of Thrones. He claimed he was a mercenary, and sounded very, very Russian, but then when I asked whereabouts in Russia he was from, he almost blew a gasket. He said he wasn't Russian, but he hated Russians, and that he was from a place called Moldova, where hating Russians was a sort of national tradition. And after that I thought that he'd got the hump with me, but it turns out that was basically Yuri's default mood, at least when dealing with humans anyway. And that's because Yuri, despite being built like a brick outhouse, was a vegetarian. And when it came to loving animals, Yuri made Nick look like Colonel Bloody Sanders. And unlike the rest of us, who were only too happy to take the Foundation's money in exchange for our services, Yuri had volunteered in the truest sense of the word, as in, he was working completely free of charge. Thanks to his exceptionally dodgy line of employment, he didn't need the Foundation's money. The only reason he was there was because he loved animals and he despised what the poachers and rebels were doing. Then when I asked him how he reconciled his love of nature with his penchant for killing poachers, he told me something I never forgot. The poachers are like rats, he said. They will kill the elephant and gorilla until none remain. Then what will they do? When they have nothing left to sell and nothing to eat, they will only slaughter each other. Better to send them to hell now, while their bellies are still full. We'd all fought in our fair share of mostly pointless bullcrap wars, most of which were based on lies and greed, of course. So to be somewhere we'd chosen, doing something good for once, it felt like it was good for our souls. But if it was good for our souls, it certainly wasn't easy on our minds or bodies. Patrolling the banks of the Semliki River could be tough going, but then hiking up into the foothills of the Hrenzori Mountains had us absolutely gassed. The wildlife was a huge problem, quite literally when it came to the likes of elephants and hippos, who can become very aggressive when they feel you're getting a little too close to them or they're young. I was probably the most afraid of things like spiders and scorpions, but ironically, while their bites and stings could be incredibly painful, they weren't the things that you had to really keep your eyes peeled for. It was the snakes, like the Gaboon viper, which posed the most significant threat to our well-being. Mainly because they could be so well camouflaged among fallen leaves that by the time you do see them it's far too late and a routine patrol suddenly becomes a casualty evacuation, because you might just lose your leg, or arm, or whatever it's bitten, unless you get fast treatment. We were told that the bats who roosted up in the trees in the forest were riddled with things like rabies and even Ebola, and that if we got guano anywhere on our bare skin, especially around our mouths and faces, we were to report to the medics immediately because it was a potentially life-threatening level of exposure. We were also told to be on the lookout for bees and wasp nests because, if disturbed, their African variant had been known to pursue interlopers relentlessly before stinging them to death. And we had to worry about aggressive monkeys or baboons, and the crowned eagles that nested up in the mountains could blind you in a dive bomb attack launched from nests that you wandered too close to. We also had to keep away from the freshwater snails who carried parasites that make death feel preferable to going to the toilet. But without a doubt, The thing that scared me the most were the tsetse flies. Tsetse flies are a little bit like horse flies in that they're the size of a housefly but will give you a pretty nasty bite. However, unlike horse flies, who as far as I know can't pass on any disease, tsetse flies can pass on a nasty little parasite which causes something called sleeping sickness. The early signs are things like headaches, high temperatures, and joint pain, and so at first it seems like little more than a stubborn cold. But then later, once the parasite invades the central nervous system, it can cause some horrifying symptoms. I'm talking about things like distinct and frightening personality changes, mobility issues, and a sudden desire to sleep during the day and stay awake during the night. Then, without treatment, the afflicted can grow weaker and weaker until they pass into a coma and die. Seeing as there are no vaccines for the disease, everyone at base camp, Congolese included, were absolutely terrified of tsetse fly bites and the sleeping sickness they caused. But thankfully, preventative measures meant no one came down with it, at least not while I was there anyway. Those were just the natural hazards that we had to worry about, but it was the unnatural ones that posed much more of an active and deadly threat. I remember the first time that we were out on patrol, the first of many snipers' bullets whistled past me. We were walking through fairly long grass at the time, so we were able to hit the deck and wait it out until it was safe to get moving again. Usually speaking, a small group of poachers would see a much larger ranger patrol and take a couple of pot shots at them and then just scarper while we were all in cover. They were terrible shots and probably didn't even zero their weapons properly because who needs accuracy when you're shooting an elephant? But that being said, it never failed to get the blood pumping whenever you heard that crack or whiz depending on how close the shot came. Back when I was in the army, if we took shots from a sniper, we'd have our machine gunners ripping up the horizon, or we'd be calling in airstrikes on positions we even thought might be occupied by said sniper. But then, with the Virunga Rangers, we had to hold our fire as much as possible out of consideration for the wildlife. The poachers shot at whatever the hell they wanted, whereas we had to be absolutely certain about our targets and we couldn't open fire. That was very reminiscent of Afghanistan, so it was something I could adjust to. What I couldn't adjust to was almost being completely outgunned by the enemy. The Rangers' armaments consisted of mostly AK variants, be they Chinese or Eastern Bloc, and then a few shotguns and scoped hunting rifles for close quarters or long-distance engagements. The poachers' rebel allies, on the other hand, were able to field light machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and even light artillery in the form of 82mm mortars. I'd had mortars fired at me in Afghanistan, so again, I knew exactly what to expect. But as it turned out, getting shelled in the Congo was a hell of a lot different than getting shelled in Afghanistan. I remember the first time it happened, we were patrolling the gentler slopes near the base of the Rwenzori Mountains. And this was always risky, as the heavily armed rebel group made the mountains their HQ. But it was a case of either putting on a show of force, or show we weren't afraid of them, or they'd take it as permission to run riot in the park's northern sector and lay waste to the many families of elephants who made it their home. So there were 14 of us walking up and down the slopes, me, Patty, and Tanner, then 11 Virunga Rangers. We hadn't had any trouble patrolling the forest, but then we had to clear quite a large area of mostly open ground to make sure that the poachers hadn't left any traps behind. We'd been plodding through this field of long grass for a few minutes when I suddenly heard what I thought was a light aircraft passing overhead. My eyes darted upwards, but despite the clear blue sky, I couldn't see anything flying in the air above me. But that thought must have lasted no more than half a second, because as I heard the noise take on that telltale descending drone of incoming ordnance, I knew what was coming. I just never heard a mortar shell scream like that as it came hurtling down towards me, and the sound it made was nothing short of petrifying. Afghanistan is a dry place, so when something flies down from the sky at you, it makes a very distinct hissing or whistling sound. But in the Congo, it was so damp that the humidity affected the sound of incoming shells. That dry hissing before something exploded was bad enough in Afghanistan, but the shriek those mortar shells made in the Congo made it feel like the rebels were firing freaking banshees at us. They'd scream this 3-second long sphincter-puckering wail that sounded to us like, "We're coming to get you." And that, let me assure you, was somehow far worse than getting next to no warning at all. And then, unlike Afghan, there were trees everywhere for the mortars to smash into, and when they did, the explosion would send a shower of splinters into whoever was unlucky enough to be standing under said trees. I saw some pretty horrific injuries in Afghanistan, but nothing like what I saw in the Congo. All the rangers wore soft covers, either khaki bush hats or their signature forest green berets. So when mortars or RPGs exploded in the trees above them, they were incredibly vulnerable to the shrapnel and splinters that came tearing down through the canopy. I saw a bloke with a splinter the size of my arm sticking out of his face. It severed his spine so severely that he'd essentially been internally decapitated as it drove its way into his body, the only mercy being that it was quick and relatively a painless death. Another ranger was not so lucky. A rebel RPG gunner scored a direct hit on the tree that he was taking cover behind. The warhead-shaped charge punched through the trunk like it was nothing and cut the ranger in half at the waist. It only managed to drag half of him out of the fight, and he stayed alive and in pain for a shockingly long time. The rest we had to leave for the animals. Nick, the bleeding heart American lad, took a bullet through the shin during a patrol along the river. It punched such a big hole through his leg that we thought that he was going to lose it, and as the massive, definitely not Russian Yuri tied the tourniquet around his leg and threw him over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, he was swearing and shouting, "My mom's going to be so mad at me." It's weird where your mind goes in moments like that. You take a bullet through the leg fighting poachers in Africa, but all you can think about is your old mom back home and what she's going to think about it. Not the months of surgery and rehab or the risk of infection. You think about your mom. But without a doubt, the scariest thing that happened when I was in the Congo happened towards the end of my 6-month stay. We were manning some listening posts out in the forest overnight, maybe 10 to 15 miles away from the mountains. It was something the rangers had taken to doing in order to intercept the poachers who'd sneak down the mountains during the wee small hours of the morning before preying on animals at dawn. The tactic has proved very effective already, but they wanted to know if there was anything they could improve on in terms of positioning and procedure. So me, Patty, and Yuri ended up going out there with them one night. Nighttime in a war zone is always very frightening, and any little sound scares the shite out of you. Then, factor in that we were in Africa with all kinds of massive creepy crawlies skittering around our wee fighting holes, and it made for some pretty scary moments. But none more frightening than the time we got ambushed whilst in pitch darkness. We were in our fighting holes, all spaced out over 3/4 of a mile, when one of the rangers started keying his radio handset. A soldier might do this if he suddenly spotted the enemy so close to him that he can't talk, or the enemy might hear him. So as you can imagine, we were expecting a scrap. But when it came, it wasn't the usual chaos we'd grown used to. It was surgical. One Congolese ranger got shot in the chest. Then when we all dived into cover, another ranger leaned out from the tree that he was hiding behind in the hopes of catching sight of a muzzle flash. But no sooner than he did, he took a bullet right between the eyes. That's when I realized whoever was shooting had some sort of night vision capability. They could see us, but we couldn't see them. It must have been like shooting fish in a barrel, to be honest. Rangers who exposed themselves to try and suppress the shooter were almost immediately cut down. Then as we all turned tail and fled, we were doubly exposed. As we ran, more and more of us fell, and for the first time, I was certain that the next bullet had my name on it. There were loud, blood-curdling cracks as bullets passed inches over our heads, and then ear-splitting screams or anguished grunts whenever one found its mark. It was easily the single scariest combat experience I had ever endured, and to this day, I'm not sure how I was able to walk away from it unscathed. Not when so many others didn't. There were about 20 rangers manning the listening post that night. 20 men who converged on one position with the goal of overwhelming what we assumed was a much smaller force. But it was us that ended up getting overwhelmed. Of the 20 men that went out into the forest that night, only 6 returned, and unfortunately, Yuri wasn't one of them. He wasn't the first foreign volunteer to make the ultimate sacrifice for Virunga and its animals, and I doubt that he'll be the last. But he was the only man to give his life when I was there, so I imagine I'll remember him till the day I die. There were a few more incidents like that, men being inexplicably shot under the cover of darkness, and then one day they just stopped. We went back to owning the night again. The poachers and rebels didn't seem quite so bold anymore, and although that obviously made us all very happy, it left us asking a lot of questions. How had the rebels suddenly got their hands on night vision equipment? And why had they suddenly opted not to use it anymore? They weren't exactly short of cash for the most part, and nor were they professional soldiers, so it was possible they'd bought themselves some expensive thermal imaging equipment only to break it through improper use or lack of maintenance. The theory swirled for a while, and then one day, Top, the coordinator for the foreign volunteers who met me at the airport, said he'd heard a chilling rumor on the SOF grapevine. Apparently, a group of Chinese mercenaries had signed a short-term contract to work somewhere in the Congo. The Chinese have been pretty heavily involved in sub-Saharan Africa for a while now, with their Road and Belt initiative, so it wasn't out of the question that a Chinese-based private military contractor were operating in the region. But when one ex-SOF guy heard that they were headed to North Kivu, exactly where the Virunga National Park is, he figured that was information we needed to know. Unfortunately, we got the news way too late, but as any soldier might tell you, that's something you get used to in a conflict zone. The thing I couldn't get my head around was the fact that we might well have almost been ambushed and killed by Chinese special forces, either former or serving. We'd heard rumors that the poachers had backing from wealthy Chinese smuggling outfits who were heavily invested in the importation of rare animal parts, but for the longest time, we'd considered it just that, a rumor and nothing more. Yet what happened that night at the listening posts, as in the speed and precision with which we were ambushed, had made me a firm believer and makes me think that there's a much more shadowy game being played. After I got home, I read a book about the Scramble for Africa, which was the rush by European powers to colonize the continent in the late 19th century. My intention was to learn more about the place I'd almost died in, but all it did was make me consider the present. It seems to me like there's a new scramble for Africa, and the intentions of the countries involved this time are around just as ill as those who took part in the first. Born on September 21st of 1940, Lowell Lee Andrews' hometown newspaper once described him as the nicest boy in Wolcott, Kansas. Founded in the mid-19th century, Wolcott was named for the railroad official who lobbied for an extension of the Missouri Pacific Railroad into the area. This allowed it to become closely linked with nearby Kansas City, and ever since, it's been considered a sleepy attachment to the city's bustling urban sprawl. It's here that young Lowell Andrews grew up, and back in the 50s, Wolcott was still a small, mostly rural portion of Wyandotte County. It was surrounded by farmland and orchards, and despite the construction of a nearby highway, the town was reluctant to urbanize in the same way as other suburbs had. It was a quiet, quaint, and wholesome little town, where young Lowell's intellect and music talents were allowed to flourish. He was a passionate reader, played bassoon in the college band, and by the late fall of 1958, an 18-year-old Lowell had enrolled at a local college to study biology. But despite outward appearances, Lowell did not enjoy his life in Wolcott and was firmly convinced his future lay elsewhere. During late November of 1958, Lowell and his older sister had both returned home to spend Thanksgiving weekend with their parents. 20-year-old Jenny was enrolled at the University of Kansas, where she was studying to become a teacher, and on the evening of Friday, November 28th, she lay on the couch watching TV with her parents after a dinner of leftover turkey. Lowell, on the other hand, chose not to join them, and instead sat upstairs in his bedroom reading the final novel of seminal Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky, entitled The Brothers Karamazov. Set in 19th century Russia, The Brothers Karamazov is a passionate philosophical novel that discusses questions of God, free will, and mortality. It has also been described as a theological drama dealing with problems of faith, doubt, and reason in the context of a modernizing Russia, with a plot that revolves around the subject of patricide. After reaching the novel's conclusion, Lowell is believed to have closed it, placed it down on the desk in front of him, and remained in silent thought for a prolonged period of time. Lowell then walked into the bathroom, lathered up his face, and shaved using his father's safety razor. He did so with precision and care, ensuring that there was no errant whiskers or accidental cuts. Then once completed, Lowell walked back to his bedroom and put on the black two-piece suit his parents had purchased him following his college acceptance. Lowell stopped for a moment to inspect himself in a hallway mirror, ensuring that his hair and attire were nothing short of immaculate. And then after opening a closet in his bedroom, Lowell retrieved a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle and began walking downstairs. There in the Andrews family's living room, his parents and older sister had their eyes fixed on the TV. They heard Lowell's footsteps in the doorway but didn't turn to look. Since they were watching a movie, and in order to replicate the magic of the movie theater, the Andrews family had turned out their living room lights. When Lowell flicked them on, they vocally protested, but as his mother, father, and sister turned to look at him, looks of terror filled their eyes. Lowell hadn't turned on the lights to ruin their movie experience. He turned them on in order to better aim his rifle. The first of Lowell's bullets punched through the skull of his older sister, killing her instantly. Sprawled out on the couch and in direct view of Lowell as he walked into the living room, she presented the easiest and most obvious target. Lowell's parents, on the other hand, died much, much harder. Lowell put 3 quick bullets into his 50-year-old father, William, and then did the same to his 42-year-old mother, Opal Andrews, as she tried to shield her husband's body. Lowell took a moment to calm himself before beginning the next phase of his plan and approached a living room window before hearing movement coming from behind him. He returned to find that somehow his mother had survived her injuries, and after staggering to her feet, she lunged at him. In little more than a second, Lowell Andrews put 3 more bullets into the woman that had raised him. She fell to the floor, took her final breaths, and then passed away. Lowell stared at her lifeless body for a moment, regarding his murdered mother with a chilling lack of emotion. Seconds later, he heard more movement behind him. Lowell turned, only to see his bleeding father crawling towards the kitchen telephone. He took aim, sending multiple .22 caliber bullets into his father until his ammunition ran dry. He then took out a Ruger .22 caliber pistol from his hip holster and emptied all of its bullets into his father's back. It was a brutally cold-hearted execution, but Lowell wasn't done there. When his pistol quit firing, he ejected the empty clip, loaded a fresh one, then began shooting into his father's lifeless body almost at random. A homicide detective later said that it was as if Lowell had wanted to observe the damage his shots inflicted to different parts of his father's body, a sickening experiment performed on the man who raised him. Lowell fired a total of 6 shots at his mother, but 17 at his father. Then, when all was said and done, he began staging the scene to make it appear as if a household burglary had somehow gone horribly wrong. He opened a window in the family living room, then stacked garden furniture outside it, intent on giving the impression that someone had climbed through the window while the family were dozing. Police were meant to assume that an outnumbered home invader had panicked upon waking the family, and in the ensuing chaos, had murdered them one by one. Lowell then drove over to his apartment in the nearby town of Lawrence, Kansas, where he began to establish his alibi. Having lent a friend his precious typewriter, he arranged to pick it up that evening under the pretense that he had to write an essay. Then, after dropping the typewriter off at his apartment, Lowell visited a local movie theater where he attended a showing of the 1958 movie Mardi Gras. He spoke loudly, imparted friendly greetings to other theatergoers, and placed himself in the very rear of the theater so that everyone filing out at its conclusion would see him seated quite prominently at the back of a well-lit theater. Once the movie was over, Lowell decided to drive to the banks of the Kansas River, where he dismantled the weapons used to murder his family and tossed the separate parts off the Massachusetts Street Bridge. He then returned to his apartment telephoned local law enforcement and informed them that he strongly suspected his parents' house had just been burgled. However, when the police arrived at his apartment and were forced to pass on the bad news of his family's murder, they observed that Lal expressed only the slightest amount of surprise. Yet not only did Lal seem unperturbed at what would normally be considered devastating news, there was barely a hint of emotion about him. When asked how he knew of the potential break-in at his parents' home, Lal began obfuscating. Then once he admitted his 911 call was prompted by what he called a bad feeling, he was promptly arrested as the case's primary suspect. Whilst in police custody, Lal vehemently protested his innocence. He claimed that he had a falling out with his parents prior to Thanksgiving and hadn't been over to their place in weeks. But the fact that Lal seemed to have had a mysterious premonition regarding the incident which led to his parents' and sister's deaths was extremely incriminating. Homicide detectives pressed him for hours, demanding to know why and how Lal had killed his family. It took the intervention of the family's minister, a pastor Vertio C. Dameron, to finally coerce a confession from who he'd once considered a promising young man. Dameron reportedly gave the boy a Coke before asking him, "You didn't do this terrible thing, did you? If you did, now's the time to purge your soul." Lal might have finally admitted to the murder of his mother, father, and sister, but the confession was completely devoid of remorse. Lal told police officers, "I'm not sorry, but I'm not glad I did it either. I just don't know why I did it. I didn't even feel anything as they died." At his trial, the defense argued that Pastor Dameron's testimony of Lal's confession should be stricken from the record. They further explained that Pastor Dameron, quote, occupied the role of minister of the church of which the defendant was a member, essentially claiming the relationship had unspoken confidentiality, similar to that which exists between a doctor and a patient. But as Pastor Dameron himself asserted, there was no course of discipline in the Baptist church by which a member thereof was enjoined to confess his sins to a minister of the church. On the advice of his defense team, Lal pled not guilty to reason of insanity and was subsequently sent for tests at the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas. It was here that Dr. Joseph Satin established that Andrews was almost certainly schizophrenic, but that he had been completely compos mentis, or of composed mind, at the time that he murdered his family. Dr. Satin went on to call Andrews' crime a sudden murder, meaning his behavior had been perfectly regular both before and after his family's slaughter. This led the doctor to believe the state was well within its right to prosecute Lal to the full extent of the law, in which they promptly did. After taking the stand, Lal's pleas of insanity fell on deaf ears, and following his conviction, he was condemned to be executed. After his request for clemency was denied by the state's governor, Lal was asked about his family's funeral arrangements. "I don't care what you do with them," he said. Then, when asked if he had any regrets regarding the murders, he stated, "I didn't feel anything about it. The time came and I was doing what I had to do. That's all there was to it." After further appeals for clemency were disregarded by the U.S. Supreme Court, Lal Lee Andrews was executed by hanging on November 30th of 1962, aged just 22. His last meal consisted of 2 fried chickens with sides of mashed potatoes, green beans, and pie a la mode, and he gave no last words. Those in attendance gave eerie accounts of Lal's final moments, with one reporter stating he was, and I quote, outwardly remorseless and disinterested. Another reporter, this one from the Associated Press, said Lal was actually smiling slightly as he was led to the gallows. Because Lal was a hefty 6'1" and 250 pounds, it's believed that he had to hang for some time before he was pronounced dead. Other witnesses claimed the rope actually broke, but despite their proliferation, such rumors were never confirmed. Lal Andrews was one of the last people to be executed in the state of Kansas. He was subsequently buried next to his parents and sister in the Mount Salem Cemetery in Excello, Missouri. The 3 family members were labeled on a single tombstone. Lal's separate tombstone lies parallel and is engraved with a single word, son. Prior to his execution, Lowell was detained at the Lansing Correctional Facility, the very same place as the murders of the Clutter family were being held, Richard Hickok and Perry Smith. Hickok and Smith had been made infamous following the release of Truman Capote's book, In Cold Blood, with the former being asked what he thought of Lowell Andrews following numerous daily interactions with him. He was a funny kid, Hickok said. He had no respect for human life, not even his own. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, in Jesus' name, boom shakalaka.
Since 2007, human feet have washed ashore along the eerie coastlines of the Salish Sea. With no signs of struggle and no clear pattern, the discovery sparked wild theories. As more feet continue to appear, the sea keeps its secrets and the mystery deepens. Hear more about this over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, all linked down below.
My name is Joseph, and I'm from Austria. Many years ago, I went on a long-awaited dream holiday to Paris, France. I had always wanted to see the Eiffel Tower, walk along the Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honore, explore the catacombs, and visit Notre Dame Cathedral. It's such a tragedy what happened to that. But I finally saved up enough money to take the time off from my job as a chef and surprise my girl with a trip to the City of Love. We drove there from our home country of Austria and had a nice road trip on the way, staying at various locations and making many happy memories. Then we reached Gay Paris. It really was the most romantic city. We dined under the shadow of the Eiffel Tower and the twinkling city lights. We took long walks along the Seine and made love in our hotel room with the windows open to the late-night city. Apologies if this is not appropriate to share, but we Europeans are just sort of a free people who are not ashamed of our love for beautiful women. It was perhaps our fourth day in Paris, when myself and my lover Amelia were seated in a cafe awaiting our latest delectable taste of French cuisine. I had parked our car on the street outside. There was a parking space next to it, and I thought nothing of it, as the average car would be able to fit in there. A man came driving along and idled beside the space. The movement caught my eye, and I watched him with some curiosity, as I am always interested to see how other people maneuver into parking spaces. I forget the brand of car that this man had, but it was clearly too big for him. He did not possess the necessary skill to navigate into the parking space. Instead of giving up and moving on, however, he began to use his vehicle to shunt the cars on either side of the space in order to widen the gap. My car included, of course. Shunting a parked car like that can shatter the steering column or the axles, and this absolute Oslok was going hog wild doing it to my car and that of the hapless stranger parked adjacent to me. Naturally, I rushed out of the cafe and into the street. I yelled at him, in German, forgetting myself for a moment, and he pulled his car to a stop, pushed against mine, and climbed out. This man was a burly, dirty-looking dock worker type who fit every stereotype of the rough and vulgar Frenchman that I'd ever seen growing up. Nothing like the actual people that I'd encountered in Paris thus far, I might add. I could tell that he didn't understand a word that I was saying to him in German, but my French is pretty merda, so I tried English. I told him that he would damage my car and the neighboring car and his own car too, and to stop being a dep and go and park somewhere else if he wasn't able to fit his stupid vehicle in the space. And the man called me a filthy Spanish pig, and then told me to go back to Spain. I raised an eyebrow at him and called him a slur that I probably shouldn't have said, a very rude word in Austrian that sounds a little like foot but means something very different. And this was a big mistake because apparently he understood enough to know what I was insulting him with. And this burly man almost leaped over the hood of his car and came running towards me. He jabbed one huge finger right into my chest, almost knocking me backwards as he did so. I really hoped that Amelia would stay in the cafe and not draw attention to the fact that she was with me. Now this road rage Frenchman began to yell at me, and spit was flying from his lips. Now in English, I asked him to politely back off, but instead, he grabbed me and pushed me up against the wall. He put one fist next to my head in a clearly threatening gesture and began screaming right into my face. In that moment, I understood why they become road rage incidents, because I felt the anger burning inside me too. How dare this boorish man yell at me and get spit in my face? I was a visitor to his city. Besides, he was the one who had repeatedly shunted that car like some moronic bull. So I said this to him, trying my best to seem angry and threatening, and then shoved him backwards to get him off of me. Now this was a huge mistake. The Frenchman barely budged, and then sneered at me and started laughing. He drew his fist back, ready to clock me in the jaw. I ducked, and then he punched the granite wall behind me. Now no sooner had he started to howl that I delivered a kick to his nether regions and ducked under his arm. Now I probably should have kicked him harder because it did absolutely nothing to slow the enraged Frenchman driver down. He reached out to grab me, and I could see actual murder in his eyes. He was snarling and frothing like some kind of drunken animal, and I'm sure he was indeed plastered even though it was only 3 in the afternoon. My moment of confidence was over. I bolted, running from that angry driver down the street calling for help. Paris, which had once seemed such a romantic and wonderful place, now seemed hostile and uninviting to me. Passers-by looked on with just blank dismissal as I thundered down the sidewalk, my lumbering aggressor behind me. Thankfully, I was fitter, healthier, and smarter than him. I darted through a crowd, then across a courtyard, and eventually found myself looking at the Louvre Pyramid. An art gallery and museum seemed like the perfect place to lose a man such as this, so I darted past the glass structure, ducked into a building, and quickly found a public toilet. I hid in there and called Amelia on my cell and asked her to keep an eye out for the guy. She told me she was still in the cafe and that the police had been called, and the man's car was being clamped and towed. I stayed in the line with her as she described the next scene. The angry driver returned to his car and saw officers milling around the vehicle. I suppose in his drunken stupor, he mistook one of the officers for me and began to grab him, and then got forcibly thrown to the ground and subdued with batons. Amelia described it to me as I cowered in the bathroom, and I have never been more grateful in my life to miss out on something. The man and his car were carted away, and I have no idea what became of him, and I really don't care to know. Thankfully, our car was undamaged and we enjoyed the rest of our trip to Paris, but I have never trusted French drivers to park their cars properly to this day. A few years ago, I went on vacation from the States to Eastern Europe. Now, I don't want to say exactly which country I went to, because it was most definitely wonderful and I don't want to give it a bad name. I did a lot of traveling around the country, and while most of the places I visited were great, with awesome people and some pretty sick food, just an awesome time in general, there were a couple of joints that were absolutely seedy as hell. One of them was a town I'll just call Hellville. I stayed here for a week when I was backpacking, and I was meeting a female friend a week later and planned to spend a bunch of time with her. So for now, I was just kicking back and exploring this little town of Hellville that I found en route to our digs. I could tell that it was a sketchy place as soon as I hopped off the bus into town. It had a vibe kind of like Eli Roth's hostel, and my dumb self found that pretty exciting. I'd joked the whole time before my vacation that I was going to stumble across some backwoods village where the locals kidnap tourists for the entertainment of rich sickos, and I was almost excited by the fact that this place looked like it had potential. Yes, I know that I was, and am, an idiot. The first night I got way too drunk in the local Hellville dive bar and almost got into a fight with a Chechenian ex-military guy until we realized it was a big misunderstanding and ended up dancing and singing through the streets. Matthias became a good buddy then, and we exchanged cell phone numbers. He was backpacking through Europe too, and in our drunken stupor, we worked out that our routes would intersect a bunch more times, so we should look each other up. Feeling good for making a new friend, especially a badass Czech former soldier, I collapsed into bed in my hostel, being snapped at to shut the F up by more than one angry traveler. The next day, I went exploring Hellville. There wasn't really much to explore, just a few unhygienic-looking bars and cafes, a central square with an honest-to-God village well in it, which I was certain would give me cholera, and then a bunch of farmland. I took a stroll through the countryside to see if I could find any of those classic European milkmaids hard at work in the fields. Sadly not, but I did spy a few gruff-looking farmers and a group of teens in tracksuits that I didn't really like the look of. They were sitting on a fence, chattering in their language, and I could tell that they were talking about me because they were pointing at me and then whispering to each other and laughing. Despite being my arrogant self, I decided to make like a tree and split. I tried to look as casual as possible, but quickly broke into a jog. Now my heart sank as I heard footsteps and the sound of teenage voices behind me. A couple of them sprinted ahead to catch up with me and stood blocking my route back into town. There must have been 5 or 6 guys in total, 4 eventually facing me and then 2 big meatheads blocking off the return path. One of them pointed to my shoes and said something about trainers. I didn't understand for a moment, and then he muttered something about Nikes and then sneakers. I remembered Europeans referred to sneakers as trainers and then realized that he was saying that he liked my Nikes. I said back, yeah, that they were nice sneakers, but very cheap ones. Now this was true, they were probably only $100, nothing to get excited about. This caused the teens to start laughing cruelly, and then the obvious ringleader pointed at my shoes again and referenced that damn Daniel meme from years ago. I politely laughed, and he began to shove me, saying something in his language that I didn't understand. I could tell from his body language that he was asking why I was laughing at him though, which I'm sorry, but I thought that that's what you're supposed to do when someone says a meme, even if it's an ancient dead one. I had no idea how to convey it to this guy though, who clearly just wanted to start trouble with me. His buddy, a fat pig-looking guy with a Michael Cera bum-fluff mustache, also pointed at my shoes and told me to take them off in some broken English. Now under no circumstances was I gonna give these a-holes my sneakers. They might have been cheap Nikes, but they were mine, and they served me pretty well on my backpacking trip so far. I told them to F off, and then realized that this might not be a good idea when there were 6 of them and 1 of me. I turned to leave and realized that one of the bigger guys blocking my path was actually carrying a knife. Now it was only a Swiss Army knife and looked rusty as hell, but I didn't really like my chances of survival if that thing went into my gut. I was surrounded on both sides, so I did the one thing they hadn't counted on. I leaped the fence to my right and began to sprint across the fields like I was back in high school track. These teens started yelling and shouting, and I heard a crash from behind me as they leaped and toppled over the fence. One of them, probably the fat kid, had fallen to the ground and tripped a couple of more of them up. I continued to sprint, glancing over my shoulder and saw that 3 of them were still following, including the leader and the one with the knife. Now this knife guy wasn't that fast, but the leader was leaping over ditches and all sorts of stuff and clearly knew the land better than I did, so he was gaining on me. I kept running, looking for help of some kind, any kind. Did they even have cops patrolling the streets here? I certainly hadn't seen any kind of law enforcement. Hell, I'd take a miserable-looking farmer at this point. Surely these teens wouldn't stab me to death for my sneakers in front of the villagers. I had no idea what the place might be like, though. My mind went back to how I'd joked about looking for a town like in the movie Hostel, and I cursed myself for being such an idiot. I wasn't even going to die in a cool way by having my eyes cut out or my wiener fed to dogs or anything. I was going to get murdered in the middle of some ass-backwards nowhere place just because these kids wanted my $100 sneakers. Hell no, I thought. I doubled my efforts and leaped across the fields, vaulting a fence or two in order to escape my pursuers. A stone whistled past my head, and then another, and I realized the teens had stopped to scoop up projectiles at some point, and I was now in serious danger of getting my skull cracked as well as a knife between my ribs probably. A voice in the back of my head told me that maybe I should just hand the sneakers over, but my ego wouldn't allow it. Instead, I managed to run to the village. The first place I thought to go was the local bar, and thank all that is holy, my ex-military pal Matthias was actually sitting at the bar, just nursing a Coca-Cola or something and chatting to the barkeep. Now, I quickly ran up to him and told him that the kids were trying to kill me. He started laughing, patted me on the back, and said that he was sure that I could look after myself. And for some reason, he thought that I meant little children were trying to kill me. And I frantically insisted that no, it was a gang of late teens, one of them had a knife, and they were also throwing rocks. And the door burst open, and the 3 pursuers came in. The bartender said something in her language that I could tell was probably derogatory, and the ringleader of these youths snapped something back. Matthias jumped to his feet, knocking a stool over, and stood towering over even the biggest of the 3 teens. In that moment, I saw F around and find out playing out in real time. Matthias reached around the back of his belt and produced a small bag, which I realized was some kind of military-looking club. He slapped it against his palm and stepped forward. The kids froze, unsure whether to size up to Matthias or run. In the end, the bartender made the decision for them. He stepped out from the back room, shotgun in hand, and pumped it and pointed it at them. The boys started frantically apologizing, and the barman yelled something that I later found out meant, "I'm going to tell your fathers and you'll be getting the beating of a lifetime." Matthias and the barman explained to me that American sneakers are a valuable commodity to the teenagers in that country, and I should probably wear older, crappier-looking shoes if I'm going to travel around there. And Matthias even promised to hook me up with a pair of his army boots, which later he did. Now, they were 3 sizes too big for me, but I wore them with pride and still own them to this day. That night, Matthias and the barman treated me to a few drinks, and Matthias regaled me with some tales from when he was in the military. And all I can say is that I'm glad he and I did not get into a fight the night before, and I'm almost happy for the teens that they backed down when they did. Man, Matthias can be scary at times, and I'm still in touch with him to this day via email sporadically. He travels Europe like some kind of Jack Reacher drifter, only without the wild adventures, but I like to think that if he needed to throw down, he would. Now, I moved on from Hellville the next day and went to visit my female friend early. I was not sad to be out of that village, and looking back, I cannot believe how dumb I was to fight for my life instead of just handing over those damn sneakers. But on the other hand, they were nice sneakers, and I paid for them with my own money. No deranged European kids get to steal my shoes. Firstly, I want to begin the story by saying that I do think Egypt is a lovely country. It's populated by many wonderful people, and I have friends that are both immigrants and natives. I have visited the country again since the incident I'm going to tell you about, and I enjoyed my time there. Unfortunately, though, there's no avoiding the fact that attitudes to women in Egypt can be unpleasant. Things are a bit more relaxed in the country in 2025, but when this occurred in 2011, it could be extremely risky for a woman to walk around by herself, especially uncovered. A lot of Egyptian women wear hijabs or niqabs, covering their hair or almost everything apart from their eyes. Of course, Western non-Muslim women visiting Egypt just dress how they normally would, but this can be dangerous and downright stupid if you're alone. And as such, when I first visited Cairo, it was strongly advised that young women cover up as much as possible, make sure that they're with a male chaperone, and stick to the touristy areas. I was most excited about seeing the pyramids and exploring the deserts, and I wasn't even particularly thrilled about spending a few nights in central Cairo before we began our proper tour. Our tour guides insisted that it was totally worth it though, and we needed to experience the city to experience Egypt. As I followed the tour group through the bazaars, taking in the sights, the sounds, and the smells, I was starting to get won over. My dad was engaged in animated discussion with one of the guides, and they become fast friends. Mom just seemed happy to look at the rugs and ornaments for sale, and all the other middle-aged tourists were cooing and awing over the sights. I was the only young woman in her early 20s, and there was a guy my age on the tour group too, but he'd opted out of this afternoon's city tour due to food poisoning, which was really because he was hungover from the night before. Nobody was really paying attention to me, nor did I to them, which is why I didn't notice it first when I lost sight of the tour group. At first I didn't panic. They couldn't have gone far. But when I turned down the next alleyway and found myself in a crowd of unfamiliar Egyptian faces, it did cause me to pause. A few of the older male store owners were looking at me a little strangely, their eyes traveling up and down my body, even though I was wearing jeans and a long-sleeved t-shirt, the best compromise I could make in this heat. I got pulled along by the throng of the crowd, and before I knew it, I'd been kind of forced into another side of the alley, ducking out of the flow of people just so I could get my bearings. A few young men stood in a doorway, and I knew immediately that they were trouble. They sort of strutted over towards me in the way that certain guys do, and the way they studied my body made the previous store owners look reserved. They looked at me with a barely disguised hunger, and I swear to God, one of them even licked his lips. They started talking to each other in Arabic, and I couldn't understand what most of them had said, but recognized the word for cattle or cow and girl. One of them said something that caused the others to hoot and clap his buddy on the shoulders. I quickly apologized for disturbing them, which was a mistake. I shouldn't have acknowledged them or made eye contact. Before I could step back out of the alley, one of them grabbed me by the wrist and pulled me deeper into the shadows. My blood immediately ran cold. I knew exactly what they wanted to do to me and what the things that they were saying meant. One of them pinned my arms behind my back, while another one started to lift my t-shirt, running his fingers over my stomach. I felt sick and knew that this was it. If I didn't do something now, then this was going to be an event that would define the rest of my life, whether I wanted it to or not. I drew on all my self-defense training and slammed my body back into the guy holding my hands. He hit the wall with a thud, letting go of my wrists. Using the momentum, I kicked forwards at the guy who had been touching me, slamming his head backwards against the first guy's nose as I did so. I heard a crunch and a scream, and quickly pulled free as two of the guys howled in pain. The third guy had been watching, but he was the one that started to chase. I had no idea where I was running to or how I could find safety. There was every chance that I'd just run into more angry young men who were looking to tear me apart. I can't even describe the chase because it was all some blur. All I know is that the man chasing me grabbed my hair and shirt at least a few times, including one where he tore a chunk of the hair out of my scalp, causing me to cry out in pain. It felt like I'd never escaped him. Everywhere I went, crowds were surging forward, and it was only later that I learned that I was on the outskirts of a goddamn armed riot. And I think that's what saved me. Eventually, I burst into a courtyard and saw my parents and the tour group. They all looked frantic and defensive, and I guess that's why our one tour guide who'd befriended my dad was holding a brick. He barely paused as I came sprinting into the courtyard, followed by a guy who was clearly chasing me. The tour guide pulled back his arm and let his brick fly straight and true. I heard it hit my pursuer's head with a loud, hollow clunk, and he just sort of dropped to the floor like a discarded sack of potatoes. The tour guide said it was better that we got out of here because something was clearly going down. So he and the other guide led us down some more side streets and away from what he explained was turning into a full-scale riot. I asked if we should tell the cops about the guys who tried to assault me, and he just sort of laughed. We made it back to the hotel, which was gated and had armed guards. The next day, it was time for the tour group to move on anyway, and we spent the rest of the vacation at a luxury resort near the pyramids, where we lounged by the pool, relaxed, and went on various day trips to ancient historic sites of interest. Now, I love Egypt, and like I say, I've been back there since, but this was the most terrifying experience I've ever had, and one that could have changed my life, all because some people see others as less than human. This is a story I tell my buds for a laugh sometimes, but I only laugh about it because otherwise you'd bloody cry, you know? Everything turned out okay, but honestly at the time, I thought my entire life was over, and I'd spent the rest of my days rotting in a Dutch jail. So it all started because me and a mate, Milo, got really into mopeds. We both got mopeds while we were still in school. While the rest of our friends were learning to drive cars, we smugly declared that our little scooters were the most cost-effective, sensible option, and anyone who pissed all their money into the tank of a 4-seater gas guzzler was a right chump. After school, we graduated from just having our CBT, a learner's permit for mopeds, to actually passing our motorcycle tests. We were living large, riding our mopeds around town like a lame British Macklemore, that song he did about mopeds, downtown, which was unironically our theme song if you want to picture exactly the kind of insufferable twats that we were back then. Now one day, Milo excitedly showed me a video that he'd found online, advertising a group moped trip from Poland to the Netherlands. I didn't quite understand the deal at first, but as I watched the video, it seemed like we'd go on a cross-continent moped tour with the group as part of a documentary they were filming. Not only would we get to embark on the trip of a lifetime, but it would cost us almost nothing. As long as we could get ourselves there, we'd be provided with room, board, and moped rental every step of the way. I was a bit sad to have to leave my beloved Vespa behind in the UK, but as for the rest, you could not sniff at that at all. Milo was incredibly enthusiastic about it too, and looking back I didn't really have the time to pause and wonder if there was some kind of catch. And by the time my girlfriend Jane suggested it seemed too good to be true, I was already fully on board and committed to the idea, so I didn't really want to find any excuses to back out of the trip. I didn't do my due diligence and look into Pete, the guy organizing the tour. Milo said that he had though, and everything was totally on level, so hey, why wouldn't I believe my childhood best friend? We flew to Poland a couple of months later, and honestly I'd be lying if I said that the trip wasn't great. It was our first time going on a foreign holiday and we really relished it. The moped journey from Poland to the Netherlands was great fun, even if it took some getting used to riding a different machine, and me, Milo, and the 3 other guys and Pete all got on really well. After some days of fun, frolics, and breakneck moped driving, we pulled into the parking lot of the hotel we were going to be staying at in the Netherlands. Immediately it was very obvious that this was a brothel, and I shot Milo a look. This is not what we'd agreed upon. Jane would certainly not be okay with me staying in a damn brothel. Luckily for Jane, she wouldn't have to worry about it. We parked up our mopeds outside, climbed off, and then suddenly floodlights slammed on in the darkness, and loud voices were yelling. I didn't understand what was being said, but as a group of armed cops stormed into view, I understood the premise. Get down on the ground with your hands above your head. I complied, but I was almost laughing. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding. There was no reason why I should be getting arrested by armed cops. My confidence remained as they forced open the seats of our mopeds and threw our stuff to the ground. Some changes of clothes I'd stashed under the seat, nothing of note. One of the officers yanked the backpack off my back and emptied the contents onto the ground. I watched in dawning horror as an armed cop snatched up my passport and pocketed it. Then another cop began slicing open the seats of the mopeds. That's when my confidence really dissipated. I stared open-mouthed as they pulled 2 duct tape packages out of the seat cushioning that I'd spent the last few days sitting on. I didn't have to ask to know what I'd been sitting on, though. Struggling to look around at Milo, who was being kneeled on by a cop, the look on his face caused my heart to completely sink. The absolute imbecile was not at all surprised to see the drugs. My best friend had implicated me in a freaking cocaine smuggling operation without my knowledge. No wonder it had been too good to be true. No wonder Pete was such a nice guy. I had known Milo had a few dodgy contacts and dabbled in very light dealing back at home, but I had no idea he'd done anything like this. Protesting my innocence did not help, though, as I was dragged into a waiting paddy wagon and then booked and processed in a Dutch jail and thrown into a single cell where I had nothing to do but sit, fret, and poop myself in fear. Not literally. I'd never even been in trouble with the law before, and the idea that I could genuinely be going to prison, that I had actually committed a serious crime, even unwittingly. The next few days were a blur of terror and anxiety. I could not make an international call to let Jane know what was going on. I could not get a hold of Milo and wring that idiot's neck while demanding he explain things. All I could do was talk to a couple of Dutch cops who barely spoke English, but knew just enough to tell me that I was in a whole heap of trouble. In the end, it was Pete who proved to be my savior, even if he was the ringleader and the guy to blame in the first place. Milo clammed up, refusing to say anything in my defense, but in the end Pete spilled everything and cut some kind of deal where he ratted out his suppliers. Part of the deal involved telling them that myself and two of the three other guys were just clueless patsies, brought along to drive the extra mopeds. Only Pete, Milo, and a third guy, Jacob, were actually part of the drug smuggling. The day that a guy from the UK embassy came to visit me in my cell and told me I was going home, I genuinely fell to my knees and wept. I went home and hugged my mom and dad and had a bang-up Sunday roast. My homecoming to Jane wasn't quite so grand, though. I don't think she ever quite believed me that I wasn't involved in the criminal enterprise, and honestly that really hurt. I'd never done anything to make her distrust me, and after 6 months of constant jibes and jokes about my complicity, I couldn't stand it anymore, and we actually ended up breaking up. Even though the Dutch law accepted that I had no knowledge of the drug smuggling, I was still deported and banned from entering the Netherlands for 10 years. That time's just up about now, and not sure why I'd ever want to go back though, unless for some reason I wanted to visit Milo, who's still serving 2 more years on his sentence. I have no sympathy for that idiot. Even after Pete spilled the beans, Milo pleaded not guilty and got a much longer sentence because of it. It's like the American Wesley Snipes said, "Some mother lovers always trying to drive a moped up a hill." Me and my missus are writing to you today to tell you about an absolutely messed up trip to the United Kingdom that we took a few years ago. It was just after COVID travel restrictions had been lifted, so we were itching to stretch our legs and visit a foreign country, so we picked somewhere as far away from home as possible. We didn't really have a plan for our UK holiday. It seemed like a nice place, so we opened up a map of Britain, stuck it on the dartboard at the bar that I co-own with my brother, and I threw a dart at it. Well, we missed, and I would have had to vacation in the Bristol Channel, so we threw another one and landed on Sussex. We didn't know anything about Sussex, and apparently it's not really a massive tourist destination, but we picked the funniest sounding place that also seemed a bit touristy, Bognor Regis. We figured if it was crap, it wouldn't be too hard to shoot up to London early, which we planned to do for the second half of the holiday regardless. Bognor Regis was actually great. We hit the town in July, dead in the middle of the Australian winter, and despite what we'd heard about the UK, the weather was bonzer. Me and the missus spent our days sunbathing on the beach, buying crap from the seafront stores and getting sunburnt. Then, at night, we hit the bars and the clubs and tried our best to paint the quiet seaside town red. We made a bunch of friends at Bognor Regis, other tourists from all over the world, like Detroit, Belgium, Turkey, Birmingham, all sorts. One fella that we met, he said his name was Rishi, like the then Prime Minister, which we all found really funny. Rishi was a wild party animal, and it was with Rishi that we got so drunk one night that we found ourselves lost in the middle of the countryside, unsure how to get back to Bognor Regis. Me and the missus were both absolutely wrecked, and we lost track of Rishi altogether. We were out in the middle of nowhere, with no idea how we'd even managed to get there. I have a vague memory of riding in a van with Rishi and some other guys drinking cheap beer, but now me and the missus were walking along a country road in the dark, singing God Save the Queen. Rest in peace, Liz. Eventually, we came across a 24-hour petrol station and a service station. There was a Costa Coffee, but it was closed, and a McDonald's staffed by a very bored-looking teenage boy. We bought some munchies and then wandered to the gas station to see if they had the number for a local taxi firm or some type of ride. The guy at the counter directed us to a notice board, which we struggled to read in our drunken state, but eventually found a business card from someone offering taxi services 24 hours a day. I called it up on my mobile, and a very polite young woman answered. I told her where we were at, described the service station, and she said that she knew exactly where to send a driver. She told us to look out for a silver Ford and that our driver would be named Mears. Half an hour later, a car pulled into the petrol station lot, and a shifty-looking bloke gestured us over. I asked if he was Mears, and he said, sure, why not? Now, looking back, I can't be sure if we got into the right car. It's hard to get it clear in my head whether I'm just remembering things wrong or whether we really were this careless with getting into a car with a stranger. Either way, Mears, or whoever this crooked bogan was, did not have our best interests at heart. It wasn't immediately obvious. We had no bloody clue where we were, so we had no bloody clue that Mears was driving us in the total opposite direction to Bognor Regis. And by now, my missus had passed out and was snoring against my shoulder. I tried to make conversation with Mears from the back seat, but he suddenly pretended that he couldn't speak English. Weird, I thought. He'd understood me perfectly earlier. Or maybe I'd been so drunk that I just sort of slurred nonsense at him and he just sort of gone along with it. When we pulled up to a stop, I knew we definitely weren't in Bognor Regis. We were in the courtyard of some broken-down, filthy farmhouse that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Still, I saw a chicken run across the dirt in the darkness and at least one goat peering at me eerily from beyond a fence. Lovely, I thought. Mears got out of the car and yelled something into the darkness. A dog began to bark furiously and a male voice called back. I peered through the front windscreen from the back seat, squinting into the darkness, and saw two fellas join Mears. Mears had his window down so I could hear them, even though I don't think he knew that I could hear them. Fear gripped me as I realized what they were talking about. Mears was saying that we were rich American tourists. We're Australians, you wanker, I wanted to yell, and that nobody knew where we were, so they could just do us over and dump us in the acid vats out back. Bloody Nora, I thought. I didn't much fancy that either. And neither did one of the men because he vehemently disagreed with Mears, slapping him around on the back of the head even. And at first I thought this meant Mears had been kidding around. But no. The other man said that they just wanted to do me in, but the missus should be handed over to Osama and his boys, and they'd know what to do with her. I swear on my old dad's grave, when I heard Osama, I thought that they were just larrikins. But then Mears said something like, sure, maybe they'll hook us up with some of their fine, and then a derogatory term that implied that he was talking about very young women. Next, I saw the glint of steel as one of the men unsheathed some huge blade. Right, this could totally ruck off. Machetes, grooming gangs, a matey called Osama? Not bloody likely. Not for me and the missus. And I didn't even think. Drunk as an absolute skunk, I clambered into the front of the Ford Escort. The Lord God above must have been looking out for me that night because Mears the moron had left his freaking keys in the ignition. For a second I thought I was going to have a classic horror movie moment where the engine wouldn't take over and the car wouldn't start. But nah, luck was on my side. I gunned the engine and drove straight forward, even clipping Mears in the leg as he dived out of the way. Somehow, despite being a terrible driver even when sober, I managed to pull off a perfect U-turn and then send the car squealing, crashing out of the gate of the farmyard and onto the darkened country roads. I pushed that battered old Ford Escort to its absolute peak, breaking the speed limit for a good 20 minutes, hoping and praying that I'd encountered the law so they could pull me over and I could tell them everything. Eventually, I remembered the missus in the back. The lucky bird had slept through the entire thing and only now just started stirring, muttering and asking where we were and then telling me to slow down. Eventually, we found our way to a little village which had a 24-hour Tesco. Both our phones had run out of battery at some point in the night, so we went inside, and I told the poor old dear on the checkout that we'd almost been kidnapped by a grooming gang and could we possibly borrow the phone. I'd sobered up quite a bit by now, and I imagine I was still a total mess, and the missus was still rat-arsed. Now, long story short, the cops came, they searched some farmhouses in the area that could match the description I gave, but they didn't find anyone. And the car that we'd acquired had stolen plates and had been reported stolen a few years before. The cops impounded it, and for all I know, it's still in some impound lot today. The name Mears was apparently the name of a local taxi driver and had not been the guy whose car we'd gotten into. They were able to verify that the real Mears showed up at the petrol station shortly after we got into the wrong Ford. The cops did confirm one chilling fact, though. Osama was the first name of a suspect in a grooming gang case in the area. Unfortunately, our testimony didn't really help anything with that case, but I hope to God they got him. Me and the missus got off pretty lightly, all told. I still have friends who to this day insist that I got so drunk I imagined this whole thing, but I have copies of the police reports as a souvenir from our time in Bognor Regis to prove it. And I can only wish total ill will upon the men who intended to kill us, especially fake Mears. I hope it hurt when I hit you with your own car, and if you ever come to Australia, I'll happily feed you to a kangaroo, you tosser. Back in the 2000s, I went on a girls' trip to Crete. For the most part, it was absolutely awesome, especially for a history nerd like me. I loved exploring all the ruins, taking in the local history, and hanging out on the beach. And unlike at home, it was totally fine to sunbathe topless, so my pale ass didn't have to end up with an awful tan line like I usually did on vacation. In theory, anyway. Of course, I was actually way too shy to do that, but it was nice to know that I could have if I wanted to. I mention this because it's irrelevant that I'm kind of a wallflower. I don't really like being the center of attention or doing any wild things. I'm not a party girl, never have been. At the time of this vacation, I was just out of college and I'd still never even been drunk. I drank a glass of wine or two with dinner, but that was the extent of it. I was much more at home among the ancient stones of Greece than I was in the clubs, even if that was the main purpose of this holiday. I was the sensible one of the group, the designated driver, the sober Sally, and I was okay with this. I'd still go out on the town with the other girls, but I'd be the one to head back to the hotel by 10 p.m. and then awake to see the sunrise. All this to say, when I went to some Cretan ruins with one of my friends, Nora, and we met a couple of local brothers who offered us something to drink, I made them swear on Zeus that it wasn't alcoholic. For one thing, it was early afternoon. For another, I wanted to keep a clear head on because I was planning on exploring some subterranean tunnels in the ruins, and they weren't entirely safe. We'd met the boys in the town the night before, and they had construction permits for the area which wasn't entirely open to the public. They assured me that the bitter purple drink was a local recipe, a natural energy drink made from dandelions and other plants. At any other time, I would not accept strange drinks from strange men, but we were also accompanied by the brothers' grandparents and a sweet and lovely old couple who also assured me that the drink was not alcoholic and would simply give me the energy and drive to explore the ruins. Obviously, it's clear from the setup that there was something wrong with the drink, but to this day I'm certain that the family didn't intend there to be anything wrong with it. They just didn't consider the fact that their beloved family recipe might require a bit of acclimatization for an American tourist who isn't used to drinking something that contains datura. For those who don't know, datura is a somewhat poisonous plant that can be used as a recreational hallucinogen. Later, the family told me that they only used a pinch of datura in their drink to give it a kick, but I barely even drank wine, let alone hallucinogens or poison. On top of that, I was unknowingly suffering from mild sunstroke. I'd spent all morning in the sun at the ruins, and I'd mostly only been drinking this bitter dandelion and datura juice, so I was sunstruck and absolutely dehydrated. All of this was a recipe for disaster when I went down into the tunnels under the ruins, armed only with a flashlight, and decided that I could absolutely manage it alone. It didn't take long for me to start panicking. It was cooler underground, but there were strange sounds. Soon I'd lost sight of any natural sunlight and only had my flashlight to guide me. I started sensing something was wrong soon after that. Whorls and chips in the rock began to form words and pictures in the darkness. I paused for 5 entire minutes, reading some ancient writing on the wall that suddenly turned back into meaningless rock texture. And next, I was certain that I could feel hot animal breath on my neck. I spun around, and of course nothing was there. Somehow, I got it into my mind that the ghost of a minotaur was down here with me, an invisible minotaur ghost, and I began to run down the corridors, as if that would somehow help if it was in fact a ghost. I ended up just getting myself more lost and then heard scraping and the skittering of small stones. I shone my flashlight down the corridor, and a small minotaur with a hairy face was standing there. At least, that's what I saw him as in my sunstroke-addled datora-brained state. The minotaur began to advance towards me, snorting and growling at me. A voice in the back of my mind was telling me that I was hallucinating. I couldn't possibly actually be seeing a minotaur. It was an invisible ghost minotaur after all. So I stood my ground and shone my flashlight at the creature and waited for it to pass through me and disappear. Instead, the minotaur reached out and grabbed me. Stinking foul wine breath washed over me as the beast bore down on me. And for some reason, the minotaur wore a filthy fisherman's coat and fishing pants too, and he had gumboots on and a beard and a knitted cap and was also an old man. Yeah, this wasn't a minotaur. It was a hobo lurking around in the ruins, and now he had his hands on me. My head was spinning, and colors were flashing around the tunnel like I was in a magic abyss. The hobo minotaur clacked his teeth at me and slobbered down his beard, and I felt him grabbing at the waistband of my pants. Hell no, buddy. I raised the flashlight up over my head and brought it down on his forehead with a crack. This caused this hobo minotaur to howl in enraged pain and let go of me, but it also caused the flashlight's beam to weaken quite considerably. I shoved the hobo roughly against a wall and ran past him, trying to follow the route that I was sure that I'd taken. And it was a chase sequence worthy of an actual slasher movie, not least because the hobo managed to grab me a couple of times and tear my shirt a bit. Thankfully, nothing revealing, and I would have been mortified, as we've already established. It was just enough to make me look kind of badass when I came running out of the tunnels, screaming that I was being chased by a freaking minotaur. And holy crap, someone call Olympus because there was an actual monster after me. Nora grabbed me and shook me and asked me what was really wrong. Nora had been drinking the Datora drink too, but didn't seem to be affected by it in the same way I was, maybe because she was used to alcohol and also didn't have sunstroke. I tried to explain that there was a beast, but then the hobo came charging out of the tunnel screaming and yelling. Later, our Greek friends wouldn't translate exactly what he'd said, but told me that it was obscene. The hobo rushed at me and grabbed me, throwing me to the ground and flipping me over. Nora punched him and I kicked, squabbling backwards away from him as he reeled back. The Greek guys we were with came running over, and one of them grabbed the hobo and threw him backwards. He stumbled across the area, hitting a pillar hard with his arm. Some debris dislodged from the top of the pillar and fell straight onto his shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground. I heard an absolute sickening crunch of bone as the rock pinned him down, and for a moment, I almost felt bad for him, until I remembered what he'd clearly been trying to do to me in those tunnels. The elderly couple told the grandsons to take us back to our hotel, and that they'd call the cops and get the hobo arrested for trespassing. They said it was better that we didn't let them know that we'd been in the ruins because we weren't strictly supposed to be there, and the Greek police can be a bit volatile. As much as I didn't... That said, it was better that we didn't let them know that we'd been in the ruins because we weren't strictly supposed to be there, and the Greek police can be a bit volatile. As much as I didn't want the hobo to get away with assaulting me, I was still very dizzy and confused from whatever was affecting me, and also judging from the state of the hobo and his crushed arm, he wouldn't be trying to assault anyone else anytime soon. I slept off the heat exhaustion and datora poisoning, and the next day we had a conversation with these Greek brothers in which we worked out that the datora in the cocktail was the likely culprit for my hallucinations, if you haven't already figured it out. And in some ways, I think their strange concoction actually helped. It gave me the energy to fight back against this hobo and escape through the tunnels, and maybe if I'd been faced with the dark reality of the situation down in those ruins, I might have fallen apart and been unable to escape. On the other hand, maybe if I wasn't high on datora and actually had heat stroke, I might not have gone into a labyrinth alone in the first place. But really, who can say? I've got a story about Canada that I want to share with you. My family and I are from Kentucky, There's me, my wife Ellie, my 20-year-old daughter, my 15-year-old son, and my 9-year-old daughter. We go on vacation to Europe most years, but last year we decided that it was finally time to get really exotic and head to Canada. We settled in a small village near the boreal forest and went about researching the perfect Airbnb to rent for a week of wilderness tranquility and enjoyment. My wife found the perfect place, very affordable too, and we booked it. A few months later, I headed up to merry Canada with the fam in tow. My son Elijah spent the entire journey playing on his Switch and wouldn't pay attention to the beautiful natural countryside, but my wife and daughters were awestruck, and so was I. I hadn't been to Canada in many years and was bringing back a lot of fond memories. We arrived at the Airbnb, a stunning woodland property just off from the nearby village. The key was meant to be just inside this digital lockbox attached to the front of the house, but as we pulled up and got out, it was pretty clear that the box was hanging open. Great start. I tried the front door and it was locked, of course. Well, no problem. Thankfully, there was cell reception at the property, so I called up the number that we had for the owners, but no answer. Great again. Seconds later, we heard footsteps crunching under the driveway. An elderly couple waved to us and asked if we'd been calling them. They introduced themselves as the owners of the property and apologized if they were running late. They had the key with them and they could let us right on in. They were an odd-looking pair, I guess. The husband introduced himself as an ex-cop in his 70s, and he reminded me of one of the sort of Weeble toys from when I was a kid. Weeble wobbles, but won't fall down, you know the ones? He was completely hairless, like shiny bald and free of eyebrows, but he had a huge bushy beard that I kept staring at because I was certain it was a wig. Is that what you call a fake beard? To this day I don't even know, and the icing on the cake was his name. He said his name was Gerald Garibaldi, and I began to laugh when he said this, but my wife kinda elbowed me, and Gerald Garibaldi looked slightly excited, as if he had no idea what the joke was. And the wife introduced herself as Maureen Garibaldi, and the hair on her face wasn't a wig. It was unfortunate, but Maureen Garibaldi had a few thick whiskers sprouting from her chin, and a very prominent female mustache that looked like it hadn't been waxed since pretty much ever. Not that she had any obligation to actually wax, of course, but needless to say that they were a very odd-looking couple. My eldest, Cindy, and Elliot were elbowing each other, sort of whispering and laughing, and it was all I could do to keep a straight face when my youngest, Amy, kept asking what was so funny. Maureen was in her 60s and wore a flowery summer dress that was kind of obscenely short. She had long white socks on and those black shiny shoes that honest-to-God schoolgirls wear, and I'm ashamed to say that the pair of them kind of unsettled me. Gerald and Maureen Garibaldi led us into the house and then very kindly gave us a tour that somehow managed to last nearly 2 hours. Then, they very kindly helped us bring our luggage in from the car, and then kindly helped us unpack the kitchen things and food and other essentials, and then kindly sat there like eager puppies, clearly waiting for us to invite them to stay for dinner. It was the first night of our freaking vacation, though, and I really didn't want those weirdos encroaching on our family time, but hey, what could I do? They were very kind. And that phrase became a running joke because the Garibaldis continuously told us that we were very kind for this and that thing. Over dinner, Gerald Garibaldi talked and talked and talked, and the rest of us could just do nothing but listen. And the crazy thing is, I couldn't really tell you what he talked about. He just rambled about nothing and everything. Politics, movies, music, Donald Trump, Angela Merkel, cancel culture, the youth of today, animated violence, and those damn video games, all sorts of stuff. But I could not tell you a single thing he actually said or a single opinion he actually had. It was like the man was talking total gibberish, just saying snippets of things that made some sense or could pertain to something, but just didn't really fit together in any cohesive manner. And at one point he was talking about how Trump was the worst thing to happen to the country in years, but then 5 seconds later he was calling him the greatest damn president the country's ever seen. He kept bringing up Angela Merkel too, saying what an ugly troll she was, and Ellie and I fought to keep a straight face because I swear up and down Maureen Garibaldi could have been Angela Merkel's long-lost twin, separated at birth. Now imagine Angela Merkel dressed like a Lolita, I was told, and deepest apologies for the image. but that was Maureen Garibaldi, and don't ask me how I know any of that stuff. They were honestly like something from that weird show on TLC. I genuinely wanted to look around for hidden cameras. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Surely we were being pranked. Unfortunately, things didn't stay comical for very long. After dinner, the Garibaldis made themselves comfortable in the living room and turned the TV on. I took Ellie into the other room and asked her what the hell we were going to do. Amy was almost crying because she wanted to play board games, and Elliot and Cindy had already left to explore the outskirts of the forest before the sun had fully set. In the end, I had to very politely ask the Garibaldis if they would mind leaving for the night and letting us settle in. I expected them to display that Canadian embarrassment and a sort of aw shucks energy, but instead, Gerald Garibaldi decided to square up to me. He pushed me in the chest and accused me of being an ungrateful guest. They had allowed us into their abode, after all, and how dare we simply ask them to leave? What right did I have to try and throw a man out of his own home, especially after dinner? It started to dawn on me that these freaks did not realize how Airbnb was supposed to work. I mean, surely they realized that they were meant to leave the house while we stayed in it. And I gently tried to ask this, and they acted furious. Again, I almost thought that we were being pranked. Maybe this was one of those dumb YouTube things. But then Maureen began outright howling and crying and accusing us of being home invaders. I could not believe what I was hearing. When she threw some pretty vile slurs at Ellie, that's when I knew that this was definitely not a joke. I drew the line there. This had been funny for an evening, but it was beginning to ruin our much-needed vacation. And moreover, they were upsetting Amy, and nobody speaks to my wife like that. I have no idea, but demand that this couple leave their own property or I'd call the police. I wasn't even sure if this could fly legally, but what choice did I have? I could put a complaint in the Airbnb the next day, and if we had to find a nice hotel in the town over, then that would suck, but so be it. Surprisingly, the Garibaldis seemed terrified at the idea of me calling the cops. They heaved their considerable bulks off the couch and stormed out. Now I watched them leave, stamping their way around the outside of the house and into the forest. Now minutes later, Elliot came back in. I filled him in on what he'd missed and told him that the Garibaldis were unhinged and not to let them in if they came back. Elliot agreed and then asked where Cindy was. My heart sank. I thought she'd been with him. Elliot said she had been, but that she'd headed back to the house ahead of him because she needed to use the bathroom. Ellie was upstairs putting Amy to bed, so Elliot and I rushed outside to try and find Cindy. She was in a clearing with the Garibaldis. As I approached, I saw that Maureen was holding a damn shovel. As I got closer, I could hear what Gerald was saying. He was trying to persuade my 20-year-old daughter to come back with them to their house and have some sexy times with them. Cindy, who hadn't been present during the blow-up, was doing her best to be nice and not offend them, and I'm so proud of her for that. She was clearly worried about the shovel Maureen was holding, though, despite not knowing how volatile and weird this couple really was. I snuck out behind Maureen and grabbed the shovel from her hands. I told Cindy to get behind me, and that she didn't have to put up with this crap from these utter freaks. Maureen screamed at me, telling me that my family wasn't safe, and that they'd booby-trapped the house, and that there was a carbon monoxide leak that would poison us all in our sleep, and that they'd rigged the house to kill us. It was absolutely insane. I had no idea what we could do. There was no way that we could stay overnight in that house when the owners were this nuts. For the moment, I told Cindy to take Elliot back into the house. Then I kind of threatened the Garibaldis with the shovel, making sure they backed off and left the property. Once I was sure they waddled far enough away, I went back into the house. Inside, Ellie met me with some incredibly bizarre news. While I'd been out there dealing with the Garibaldis, she'd received a phone call on the Airbnb's landline. It was the owners, asking if we'd arrived okay and calling to wish us a pleasant stay. Of course, Ellie had told them that we'd spent an evening with the supposed owners, and my wife described the couple who'd intruded on our Canadian vacation. The actual owners, the McAvoys, told us to keep the door locked and that they'd be over with law enforcement shortly. Now, sure enough, 10 minutes later, a station wagon and a police cruiser pulled into the driveway, and that's how we met the real and very lovely owners of that Airbnb. There's a simple, if crazy, explanation for what had happened. The Garibaldis, which was not their real name, of course, were the neighbors of the McAvoys who'd been enraged on a land boundary dispute with them for years. They'd always been quietly resentful of the McAvoys, and always been an annoying but minor thorn in their side. When the McAvoys bought a second property on the other side of the Garibaldis' land, it all became too much for them, and they decided to try and sabotage the McAvoys' attempts at earning income through Airbnb by masquerading as the owners, the lunatic Garibaldis, to scare away any guests. Turns out, we were the first guests, and the Garibaldis' bizarre, grudge-driven plan almost worked. The utter weirdos had even managed to spy on the McAvoys to see the keypad code for the electronic lock and help themselves to the key. Unfortunately, that was the only real crime they'd committed, and even then it was their word against the McAvoys that they hadn't actually been told the key code. However, the Garibaldis, whose real names I won't use just in case, were known as menaces and troublemakers to local law enforcement, who were only too happy to put the scares on them enough that we had a mostly peaceful stay for the rest of our vacation. Which, I will add, the McAvoys gave us a severe discount on, meaning that for the most part, we got to spend a beautiful, tranquil vacation on the outskirts of the boreal forest for half the normal asking price. I say for the most part because there was one final scary incident before we left. On the day we were packing up to head out, after having had a great time, I was downstairs with Cindy packing up the kitchen. We heard a crash from the living room and ran next door to see that a stone had been hurled through the windows, smeared with what I can only hope was mud. We rushed outside to see a fat figure disappearing into the trees. I let the McAvoys know, and they informed the cops. I really hope for their sake that they installed some home security going forward. I do keep an eye on the Airbnb website to see if that property has ever been made available to vacationers again, and I've not seen it crop up since. It could be that the McAvoys decided that it wasn't worth trying to combat the Garibaldis, or it could just be that they're not renting through Airbnb anymore. Either way, I wish the McAvoys all the best. As for the bizarre, creepy couple, if you've ever come near my family again, I'll show you us US folk aren't quite as forgiving as our Canadian cousins. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button here on YouTube to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul, all links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Hello Kitty is for babies.